Meeting is being broadcast live on the web on the Provo City Council YouTube channel, where it will also be available for on-demand viewings. Please be aware that microphones in the room pick up the noise of paper and other rustling objects. Further, be aware that microphones can pick up side conversations. We'll begin with a roll call. Mr. Strachan.
Cliff Strachan.
Brian Jones.
David Deck. George Handley.
Dave Sewell.
Melissa Vanderwerden.
David Harding.
Kay Van Buren.
Hannah Salzel.
George Stewart.
Mayor Kafusi.
Wayne Parker. Isaac Blacksmith.
And I believe Mr. Winterton is with us, but has stepped out for the moment, so he will be joining us shortly. We will have an opening prayer provided by Mr. David Sewell.
Our Heavenly Father, we're grateful to be able to be gathered together to discuss the business of the city this afternoon. We're thankful for the many public servants and employees of the city who are involved in this business, and pray for thy Spirit to help us to have a good, productive discussion and that will lead to good decisions for the benefit of our citizens. We thank thee for the opportunity to serve in these capacities. In the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Councilor Sewell. First, before we begin, we wanted to introduce and recognize our new Deputy Chief of Police. We have our Chief Ferguson here to introduce him.
Thank you for letting me take a couple of minutes of your time. A couple of weeks ago, you approved a Deputy Chief of Police for the police department. As the city continues to grow and the department grows with it, we saw the need for more oversight, and I very much appreciate it. We went through a process with the list of captains that we currently have and interviews. Thank you for that. I have appointed and selected John Geierman to be the new Deputy Chief of Police. I'll tell you a little bit about John. 31 years with the city, and his most recent assignment is he's overseeing our criminal investigation, our detective division. Before that, he was a commander over patrol for several years. Throughout my career, he was one of my supervisors, somebody that I always trusted and went to, that always had the right answers. And my very first memory of him was as a young patrolman on a graveyard shift. I had a DUI pulled over and a car pulled up behind me with two long-haired thugs in it. And I looked back, and he was in an undercover capacity at the time. I'd never met them. And all I got was one of these. And I knew they were cops because this means code 4. This means you're okay. And so I felt immediately like this, okay, he's got my back. And I feel very secure with him, and second in command with the police department. He's going to do a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Although this is a public meeting, only the presenters and those seated at the council table may speak or ask questions unless otherwise invited by the chair. It is proposed that we approve the minutes for February 5th, 2019 for the work meeting. Are there any requested changes? Are there any objections to approval? Seeing no objection, I declare the minutes approved by unanimous consent. Item 1 on our agenda is a presentation on the Utah Valley Express ridership. This will be presented by Mr. Kent Millington, UTA Board of Trustees, as well as Ms. Mary Bellamar Schaefer, the Regional General Manager of UTA.
Thank you very much for allowing us to come here and make this presentation. We have some very good news. We want to share that good news with you. You may know that the UVX, that's what we call it now, got started, the bus rapid transit system that started and opened last August. It was for about 2 years. We were disrupting your city and Orem in preparing the way for this UVX to actually exist. But we want to report to you the results that we've had over the last several months and indicate to you some of the additional things that we are doing at UTA.
I was having trouble.
I think it's... There it goes. Okay.
Probably not a line of sight for that thing to the...
I've got to remember to point it back there instead of pointing it at the screen. So here's the results that we have achieved in the ridership for the last 2 or 3 years. Notice the blue line here is for 2017, and that's the average weekday boardings throughout the Timpanogos business unit, which is all of Utah County. So these numbers represent all of the systems. But you can see pretty clearly that back in August of last year, when we opened up UBX, the bus rapid transit system, a sudden jump in ridership. And that has been maintained throughout that time, and now here we are into 2019. You can see that we're carrying something like 16,000 people a day on our buses here in Utah County. About 10,000 of that is attributable to UBX. You can see the jump that was pretty substantial right here, and it's been maintained. Of course, you see some decline in December because the students go away, and we'll show you a mixture of where those riders are coming from as a result. You can see the real shift that this bus rapid transit system, this UBX, that we call it, has made in the ridership here. In addition to UBX, we have a number of other bus routes. The most active bus route is the one that goes down State Street from Provo to Lehigh. And you can see we're carrying about 2,500 a day in that particular bus line. And then there's the others are scattered about here throughout the rest of the county. We want to do a little illustration here with you and show you some of the concerns we have. And I will refer to these later, this 850 and 821, and show you a little difference in the reason why we're undertaking a particular study that we are at UVU, at UTA. Too many years working at UVU, I guess. Before August of last year, the bus routes 830 and 838 were carrying the students basically to the universities. You can see that there was some modest activity there. Then suddenly it jumps way up as a result of the UBX. This is simply the UBX numbers right here, the average day. Notice that in February of this year we averaged about 9,900. A little bit of a drop in March. April, we're back to pretty close to the 9,800. We're just getting the April numbers right now, and we're working them. And that's the reason we don't have the April statistic here, but it's going to come in somewhere in the neighborhood of 9,600, 9,700 per day. But there's a significant jump in the ridership here. And here's where they're coming from. Notice that here in Provo, at BYU, about 38% of the riders are from BYU. We've got 46% from UVU, and 15% right here in the community, everybody else. You know that the arrangement was made so that UBX is free for everybody, not just the students, but everyone, because we were able to get some federal funding for 3 years anyway, so another 2.5 years. So about 15% of the riders are coming from the community and not necessarily associated with the two universities. Please.
So is that based, how did you get those numbers? Are those surveys of where you're going, or is that based on where they board and disembark?
It's a little bit of both. Last year, we spent a considerable amount of time actually with teams of our people, actually on the buses, asking people, why are you riding this thing? And it was, I'm going to school, where? And then we were able to determine their relationship to the schools themselves or to just the community.
Thank you.
So we took some time to actually do some surveys. Several thousand people we were asking what their relationship is. Now, if we just look at those from BYU, 90% of them are the students, which is what you would anticipate. But we've got 7% are faculty. And then this other in the community out here, just small numbers of people that are here in Provo that are associated with the university. Scott, there was an explanation for that 2% that was a little more robust than what I just gave.
Right. They either currently aren't enrolled at BYU, or they're going to be, or so there's a population there that isn't currently enrolled or wasn't currently enrolled, but they will be that semester or the previous
Or shortly
semester.
after.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
Or just before. So, very robust group of people here. Of course, the arrangement that we have is that faculty and their dependents are also able to ride free, just like everybody else. But for BYU, about 90% of them are students, yes.
Just a thought on that. How would people show up that are, say, taking UVX to a football game or a basketball game or attending one of the weekly conferences?
They would just be among the community.
That would be, they'd show up in the community.
That's just the 15% that's community.
Okay, thank you.
I can tell you specifically on the football games. We used to do a shuttle to Front Runner, and we had 200 or 300 boardings. In this last football season, before we finished construction, we had about 3,500 boardings. So we thought people would want to ride the shuttle and UVX, but they didn't. They just wanted to ride UVX, even though construction wasn't finished and the platforms weren't done. So we anticipate a much bigger ridership than that, and we were happy with that. We pulled out extra UVX buses to accommodate that. And we've got a very nice relationship with BYU. They're getting the word out. We expect a lot more riders for this season.
Please.
Question on ridership with, what were the expectations before it was announced that it would be free? What were you expecting when people were paying versus now that it's free? Does that change? Have you seen an increase in your expectation, I guess?
Do we answer that?
Yes, Mary,
So-
what were the
When they applied,
statistics?
when they applied for the federal funds, we have about $75 million of federal funds. 2 years out, we expected to have 11,000 boardings per day, weekday. So,
2 years after it opened.
after it opened. So we're already hitting, we actually had a day where we had 11,539, not that I'm counting. We're getting close to that 10,000 mark already, and we expect it to be much higher than that next year after there's been a whole school year. The students took to the service quickly. So we jumped to 6,000 riders right out of the chute while we were in construction. We didn't finish construction until last December, as you all painfully know. We still opened early. We weren't supposed to open, if you can imagine, until right now. So we expect it. I think we'll easily hit those numbers next year. And that includes events. It was in the football games and so on are included in those numbers. So that's
Great,
projected.
thank you.
The ridership at BYU represents about a 3,000% increase over the ridership that we were experiencing from BYU students prior to UVX opening. So a very significant increase there. For UVU students, you see a bit fewer faculty mostly because the faculty at UVU, a lot of them are adjunct professors and drive in or come in later, and they're coming from work rather than living close by. But 96% of the riders from UVU are the students. And we'll see those numbers. That's a 100% increase over what we were experiencing before, because UVU was serviced a little more by the buses. But let's take a look at the total UVX boardings. You'll notice our most active station is the UVU station right there at the campus, with about 298,000 so far. This is cumulative since we opened in August. But if we just look at Provo alone, just within the Provo stations, we've had just over 1 million boardings since August. And these are the numbers for each of those stations. You'll notice very active here, the BYU South Campus, right there. The stadium, North Campus, and then you come over here to the Provo Central, which is what you would anticipate, simply because so many of the students are taking front runner, and they're coming in front runner, getting off either at the UVU station over here at Orem Central and going to UVU, or taking the front runner all the way to Provo Central and then getting on the buses and going back over to the campus. But you can see we've got out of 1.7 million that we've carried since last August, 1 million of them have boarded the UVX right here in Provo. Oh, I want to go back here.
If that
See, is
video is
this-
having trouble playing, I can pull it up separately. Is this the video?
Yes, this is the video. You got to pull that up separately.
Let's see if it,
So one of our employees has a drone, and he came over and videoed what it looks like when you're at the stations. I hope you can play it, 'cause it's on fast speed, so we can never get customers to move this fast. I just wanted, all my bus operators are like, can we
Yeah,
make
students
that
are not
happen?
that anxious to get to school, but let's see if we can.
And there's a little jaywalking problem that I worry about here, but nonetheless, this is what you'll see every time a train pulls in.
it takes a moment, at least it did when I tried this morning with another one.
Oh, there we
Yeah,
go.
here we go.
Oh, that had a weird thing.
You'll see that one UVX bus, and then there's the
Yeah,
next
here's the
one.
UVX, but you see the UVX bus, people just jumping right onto that UVX bus. There's the UVX bus right there. So that's what you see about every 30 minutes early in the morning, both at the Orem station and here in Provo.
Perhaps you don't see your customers move that quickly for UVX because it comes every 5 minutes. If you miss one, it's not that big of a deal. I've seen people move that fast to get on to front runner.
Yes,
The other way.
yes,
wanna wait
because it's
another
only
hour.
30 every 30 minutes.
Especially every hour service.
Yeah.
Speaking of front runner, here's the increase that we see from March of 2018 to March of this year. You'll notice there's an increase in each of these locations, with a very significant increase in front runner boardings here in Provo. Quite significant. As the service is becoming more familiar, people are saying, I can take the front runner all the way to Provo, I can get on the UVX and get to where I need to be. And so we're seeing that kind of very satisfactory increase. Please.
So did that increase correlate with the opening of the UVX?
Yes, you'll notice this is March, the blue is March of 2018, which would be a year ago. And this is March, the orange is March of 2019, after UVX has been opened up.
Right, so, but I'm just, month by month, you might have seen a jump in August or something. So I was just kind of curious if UVX was the main contributor.
UVX is a major contributor and probably the main contributor to that increase. That's what we ascribe it to, certainly.
That and student passes. The pass program started when UVX started, and so we see students all over the UTA system. We can track them when they tap on, and so we see them all over the system. So those student passes.
Yeah, the interesting thing is we see an increased number of BYU students riding tracks in Salt Lake County. We've tracked that. So there's been a very strong increase of BYU students tapping on the tracks trains in Salt Lake County because they can get on the front runner here, get up into Salt Lake County, and go wherever they want to go, and we track them as they tap on and tap off because of their passes. So we see that as being a very beneficial impact.
Kids, one other note about this as well. So Provo Station is now the second busiest station on the front runner alignment.
On the front runner alignment. Right.
So it's,
Behind which one?
it's North Temple or Murray?
I say
North Temple. Yeah. It's pretty impressive when you think, those kinds of numbers. Here,
Yeah, it's probably North Temple. Now, one of the things that we're doing at UTA, and you're pretty, you should be aware of this because we've held several of these activities right here in Utah County and in Provo. We're doing what we call a service choices study. We want to know what people think we ought to be doing. Should we emphasize ridership or frequency of our buses, or should we emphasize coverage? That is, we try to cover the entire county. I want to illustrate that with a couple of the bus routes. But this Service Choices program right now, we're taking positive community input to help us understand what the community would like to see us do. Do they want more frequent ridership effort in very selective areas, or more what we call coverage into less inhabited parts of the county, or our entire system from Payson to Box Elder? And so we've had a number of activities here. We encourage your citizens to go to rideuta.com/service choices and actually fill out the questionnaire. We had, what was it, last week, I guess a week and a half ago, we had one at the library and had 40 or 45 of your citizens come by and fill that out. But that's exactly what we're trying to do, and let me illustrate what we're looking at. Here is bus route 850. This is the one that goes from Lehigh Station all the way down here to University Avenue in Provo. Basically, it's Highway 89, State Street. You can see this, these numbers here are the number of weekday boardings by stop, each stop along the way. You'll notice, of course, that here in Provo, fairly significant ridership. Orem, the same. Much less so in the intervening cities, and then, of course, in Lehigh, a lot of people on the other end, because people will take the front runner to Lehigh Station, get on the 850, and come back down through the system. But this is the number of boardings and by stop. We track that entirely. So that's obviously a bus route that has significant usage. This is a little heat map of that boardings. You'll notice very consistent boardings along the entire route. Yes, sir.
Have you considered going down to Springville and going down South State Street in Provo, which is starting to get a number of projects being built?
We always consider those kinds of extensions. And that's part of what we're trying to determine with our service choices. Do we have the right mix of bus service, frequency, that kind of thing? But with this 850, which is a current bus route, we match that with what we have here in bus route 821, which goes from Payson to Provo. Notice the distinct difference in the number of people that are riding this particular bus line. In fact, if you look at a little heat map, you can see that there are large sections of that route where nobody gets on at all. No one gets on. And so one of the things we're asking in the service choices is, do we concentrate our limited resources, because we have limited resources, we only have so many buses and so much money to spend, do we concentrate our limited resources on lines like the 850 that has significant ridership, or do we concentrate all or some, or what is the balance of the resources to be devoted to this less used bus route, where we're carrying many fewer people on the bus route? That's what we're trying to determine. Where do we spend our resources? Now, do you have any questions for us that you haven't asked already? The result is UVX ridership is very strong. 1 million riders have boarded UVX in the last few months right here in Provo. We've carried almost 1.8 million since August throughout that system. It's increased front runner ridership as a result. And we've seen people from Utah County significantly tracking them up into the track system and bus systems up in Salt Lake County. Please.
Did you have, did the numbers, I'm not surprised by the student numbers, and I'm certainly very pleased by them, but did your expectations about the, I don't know what you called it, the other category, but basically people from the community,
Yeah, the community.
citizens of Provo who are not students, did you expect those numbers to be any higher than that? Do you expect them to grow? Is there something?
We expect them to grow. It's really quite interesting because you can get on the UVX at times and you'll see young mothers with babies. Obviously, they're going out for. Mary ran into 4 of them, wasn't it, the other day? They had taken their small children and they went out to lunch. And they all got on UVX here in Provo and got off up near the University Mall. And so there's a growing number of people that are finding that it's useful to use the UVX. We will be watching carefully what happens this summer. The university populations, both universities will be down, and so we expect our ridership to be down some. But it'll be interesting, we started after the younger students, elementary, middle school, high school age, were already in school last fall. It'll be interesting to see what happens with ridership this summer when they're out of school. And maybe by now they will be used to UVX, and maybe our ridership won't drop as much as we think it might because of the university students.
And related to that, I wonder about I find the Google Maps app to be, and I had somebody show this to me before I understood exactly how to use the system, which Mary knows I've been very faithfully. I got here today on UVX. I try to take it all my city visits. But the app was very helpful. Not realizing that I don't know how to schedule this sort of thing, and timing is always the question, right? So I found that extraordinarily useful because I can click on the app. I say that I want to use public transportation. It gives me all of the bus options, not just UVX.
Right.
And then I can estimate
travel times and how long it takes to get to a station.
It reduces the intimidation factor by essentially 100%. I mean, it just suddenly is much easier. So
We really hope, we think that it will happen, we hope that it will happen, that people that get used to using the system just like you are will increase our ridership, and we'll match those intended rider numbers if we go forward. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so is it 821 that goes Provo to Basin?
Yes.
And if I saw the map correctly, it looked like even though it comes up to Provo, it misses South State Street in Provo, doesn't follow Highway 89 all the way up. Does it?
Another route does. 822 does.
822 picks up South State?
Yeah, and does it freeway. The route that I think that you're wanting, we have designed it, I just need it checked.
And I bring it up because we are getting a lot of interest and a lot of projects being approved on South State Street.
On the south side, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So 822 goes there. If we had more money, we would split up some of the routes coming from the south and make them more efficient. We do have 805 that comes up from Santa Cruz and is more of an express route to the front runner. It doesn't hit where you want to go. So it's a resource, as Ted was saying, it's a resource issue. But as we grow, the demand is going to be there. And so we have plans on the book for when the funding becomes available.
And I just wanted to make sure you knew that what's coming in our pipeline and what we're doing on South State.
One of the, and that's good to know, that's part of the reason we want to come to these kinds of forums, is to hear where you see the growth happening so that we can hopefully stay ahead of that. We're making some changes to some of our bus routes around Thanksgiving Point, for example, up in Lehigh, come August, or August change day, because of the growth of the need up in the Thanksgiving Point area. We're making some significant changes. As these growth, these areas of the city continues to grow, we need that input from you as well so that we can do proper planning to be sure that we're getting them covered.
A couple of challenges that I'm facing. I have some property on University Avenue with a parking lot in the back, and I have a lot of people that are going to my parking lot, leaving their car all day and running in front of the office building and catching the bus. And that takes, do you have any suggestions for me on how to deal with that? They're just leaving their cars in my complex and taking UVX up to campus.
They're sneaky.
They are, and I appreciate them using it. That's one of my concerns, and I don't know if you have any input around that or concern. And I don't know if I can.
That's nice to know. That's the first time I've heard that, but that's nice to know. That's something that we need to be aware of.
And the other thing is, you have such a challenge with, but the only way that this is going to grow, I think, is to get that, what we call the last mile. And
Yes.
It is a challenge to deal with what you're dealing with. I appreciate the way you're doing it, is working hard to get us a good basis. And then if somehow we can get that
That last mile?
that last mile is the
Well, I
challenge.
understand that Provo City is working on that last mile with the Green Bike contract that has been, at least an RFP is out or something that I understand.
So we'll be hearing that as our very next item.
Okay, well, I'll leave it for that, but just to add this, as I mentioned to the mayor the other night, that in Salt Lake, we have made an arrangement with the Green Bike people that a pass on the on UTA system gets you a pass on the Green Bike for that first and last mile. We have an arrangement made there that perhaps you ought to be aware of, with the eye to perhaps to duplicating that very system. So that's something to just kind of tuck away. That's something we have in place up in Salt Lake, that we'd be more than happy to cooperate with you here.
George? Just one more comment. Having you as a trustee makes a great deal of difference to me. I have not been the biggest supporter of UTA.
George, I've heard that.
Ken and I worked together 40 years ago. He's a great man.
He was my boss 40 years ago in Portland, Oregon, and I learned a great deal from George. Have great admiration and respect and love for him.
Having you on UTA as a trustee and having Barry makes a huge difference to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. I appreciate that. And thank you for...
I think we have one more.
One last question here, please.
Since we're talking wish lists, just some kind of a spoke out to the Riverwoods would be great, I'm thinking, as well.
All right, thank you.
We go to the Riverwoods, we don't go often enough, and that's why you don't have the service.
Yeah, that's why you don't see it.
Increasing that frequency would be really, when Kent was talking about the 850, the 850 was a 30-minute service. In 2015, we moved it to a 15-minute service and double the ridership. So when we do more, and it comes more often, then you can use it, and it has limitations because of the frequency.
Thank you very much for allowing us to make this presentation. Please let us know if you've got other questions or comments about UTA service. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Item 2 is a presentation regarding the bicycle plan for 500 North. This will be presented by Mr. Austin Taylor, our parking and sustainability coordinator.
Thanks for inviting me to present today. So this comes because Gary was asking about the bike lane that's going to go in on 500 North. And what I was asked to talk about is just a little bit about the theory behind bike infrastructure, why we build it, why it's valuable. And then I'm going to touch on 500 North specifically. So if the presentation pulled up, I have a PowerPoint.
Did you just email it to me?
I emailed it to Bryce, and it should be, I saw it in a folder that you pulled up.
Then it'll be enough. Sorry, I'm covering for Bryce.
You're good. So number 2,
This one?
yeah. No,
The
down.
second one?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, and this should be a video.
When you play the video, it doesn't attach very well to the PowerPoint, but if it's in the file saved with it, we
Can we search on YouTube really quick?
What would you like to do?
Search value of bike lanes. And it's the third one. So this is about the transformation in New York City, how I went from a really crazy and scary place to ride your bicycle to a more friendly one, and they saw a huge increase in ridership.
We have a great ad.
The thought of cycling in a city is terrifying. You could get doored or hit by a bus.
If you were a cyclist in New York City in the 2000s, it was almost like you were a cast member from Escape from New York. But if you were maybe an extreme sport person, it was fantastic for you because you were dodging cars. It was, not a place to have, any kind of safe commuting, regular transport experience.
But today, New York City is seeing explosive growth in cycle commutes. So how did a city with traffic like this get so many people biking downtown? From 2007 to 2013, Jeanette City Khan led New York City's Department of Transportation.
I was in charge of 6,000 miles of streets, 789 bridges, 12,000 signalized intersections, 1.3 million street signs. We put down 400 miles of on-street bike lanes, including one of the first parking protected bike lanes in the United States, and we did it on 9th Avenue between 23rd Street and 16th Street.
This lane was significant because it was an early parking protected design. It's much less stressful than conventional lanes, but installing it was quite controversial because making the space for protected lanes meant the elimination of parking.
Taking away parking spaces is not for the faint of heart. And there is no super secret, magic recipe that's going to make it easier to do. But you need to make the case about what you are trying to do, right?
The 9th Avenue pilot ran for 6 blocks. And if you look at the blueprint for the street, you'll notice an alternating pattern. On blocks with right-hand turns, there's an entire lane of parking. But at left turns, those parking spots are sacrificed for a barrier. The vehicles will wait next to the bike lane here, and separate signals for cars and bikes stagger to reduce the stress at the intersection. Data show that the 9th Avenue bike lane produced economic, mobility, and safety benefits.
We saw crashes go down some 47%. Retail sales went up almost 49%. Cars had dedicated turn lanes, so the traffic processed much better. And bikes had a dedicated lane. So it was a win for business, it was a win for drivers, it was a win for people on foot, and it was a win for people on two wheels. And that really set the stage for all that followed.
Once the city analyzed data from the 9th Avenue pilot, the miles of protected lane in New York skyrocketed. By 2018, the city had nearly 1,200 miles of bike lane, and 100 of those were protected.
Because we weren't going to accommodate 1 million more people by just double-decking our streets and highways. And so designing streets for people that make it easier to bike and easier to walk and easier to take the bus, that's the kind of recipe for future success of cities. And the cities that make these kinds of investments and changes are the cities that are growing and thriving in this century.
But to really draw a crowd of cyclists, a city needs a network of low-stress bike lanes.
But you can't just paint sharrows on a street and expect that people are going to, voila, start biking. It needs to be a reliable system, and it needs to be safe. And the way that we look at the health of our bike lanes and our bike lane network is how many women and children are using the lanes. Because when you see women and kids in the lanes and families in the lanes, you know that it's safe.
Families, among other individuals, would fall into the interested but concerned group on this chart. It's from a survey taken in Oregon, but consensus in the transportation field suggests that this group is the untapped potential for cities who want to promote cycling, which is the big factor behind New York's boom in urban cyclists. And it was pretty cost effective.
The bike lanes were like 99% of our headlines, but they were only 1% of the budget. So I don't think there's a better investment. If you want to build a better city, you can start by building bike lanes.
Go back to the PowerPoint. So obviously we're not the size of New York City, but they were seeing some of the same things. Population growth, projected growth, and they wanted to see how they could move people easier, faster, more healthy, cheaper, and so they said, okay, let's invest in bike lanes, bike infrastructure, so people actually feel safe doing it, and then they saw the ridership go up. And I'd say we're doing the same thing here in Provo. With the Bulldog Boulevard project is the shining example of this. If you look at the two pictures, it's easy to tell where a mom and kids would feel safe riding. I ride on this, but I'm in that fearless category, and there's like 40% of people who are in that concerned but interested category that we need to get. And so as we design things like this, even if it takes a few parking spaces off the road, we can get more people riding bikes. And it's not forcing anybody to do anything, it's just giving options. We're allowing freedom of choice. We're letting people still drive on the street, take a bus, walk, but now we're also allowing the option of biking. This is an infographic that I made for a public meeting on 500 North. There are a lot of good reasons to put in bike lanes. There are economic reasons. There are health reasons, there are environmental reasons, but cities who do this see a lot of bang for their buck as far as investing in bike infrastructure. And lastly, I'll talk about 500 North. So why are there going to be bike lanes on 500 North? The short answer is it's in the bicycle master plan, which the council approved just a few years ago. And I believe it's in the plan because it connects the Provo River Trail, Timpanogos Elementary, the rec center, the library, and very high density areas. So it just makes sense to connect all those public assets with a very safe and protected bike facility. So that's all I have. If you guys do you have any questions?
I do have a couple of questions about 500 North. We struggle in our city with east-west connection. And 500 North has been and is one of our most used for traffic on going east and west. I wonder if it would have been more safe for bikers to move it to a different, less traveled street, 500, 700, maybe if we would have moved it to 8, I don't know. Was that examined and studied why? I know why, I can see the rec center, the library, all those things together, but that is still probably one of the busiest streets in the city at times.
I think you answered your question with that it connects all those important assets.
And
There's not another street that does all those things.
There isn't another street, but does that mean is that the reason we have to do it? I mean, if it is one of the biggest east-west, everybody, you're telling me that that they're gonna ride it anyway, even without a bike lane, and so it's unsafe? Is that what the answer is?
No, so in its current situation, there's no bike lane. This isn't 500 west, or north, but in its current situation, there is no bike lane. Would you feel safe riding on something like this? Most people are going to say no. And so if you build something like that, you're going to see more people riding on it.
So Gary, are you assuming that the bike lane means that there's less room for the cars to go through?
Less room for and they take off the parking, and that.
Because that's the question I don't think it is likely to. I mean, I don't know. The engineers might know better, but it doesn't seem like it would reduce the cars. It would reduce the parking.
It would reduce the parking.
But in terms of the flow, I wouldn't say 500 North is. This is anecdotal, but I think that's as far as crossing town, that's one of the worst choices because you have so much pedestrian traffic in addition to all those intersections, so that the flow going east-west is nothing compared to like 7th North or 8th North. There's more flow because you don't have all those intersections.
And that may be right. And what I'm dealing with here is, I think a lot of it has to do with backlash on UBX, that we lost parking on University Avenue for the businesses that were there, and now we're losing the parking for more bike lanes on 500 North. We've just lost so much parking for the businesses that are there, and they are hurting because of that.
I do have an answer with traffic flow on 500 North. So there will be a turn lane. Is there a turn lane there already? There's not. There will be a turn lane added on that street though, from Freedom Boulevard to University Avenue. Those are the drawings that Jared showed me. So that would increase car traffic flow through there because then people won't have to wait backed up to turn.
You're right, and it is, George. I think you make a great point. I'm just getting a lot of backlash because of now we're turning bike lanes. We're taking away the parking that was there.
I think the argument to support this idea, though, would be to say you're reducing the need for parking and you're increasing a different population who is going to be coming through the area. There's evidence that they're more likely to solicit some of the businesses and facilities along that path if there's a bike lane there. I mean, I don't know if that satisfies everybody, but
it doesn't. But it makes sense. It doesn't, but it makes sense.
I just want to say, I really, your presentation really hit home with me. I'm one of the 47% that's interested and a concern, not fearless like you are, but I would probably bike to work easily 3 times more often than I do if I felt safe and could get there quickly enough. I can get there quickly in the morning because I go early enough, but on the way back there's long stretches in Orem without bike lanes. And I either have to decide between safety or which I don't want to compromise, so I end up going on the sidewalk and it takes me about 20 minutes longer to get back, and so I don't do it very often because it takes so long.
Yeah.
So
I really do believe that if the infrastructure's there, that we'll see a lot more bikers.
Yeah, and you're definitely in the majority of interested but concerned. I think there's so many people that are wanting to do it, but they're just hesitant because of the way it's designed, right? We're just providing more options for people. People can still drive their cars if they want to drive their cars, that's great. I drive the car if I go to Home Depot, if I go to the grocery store, pick up a bunch of stuff. But for most of my days, I'm riding my bike because it's just me going to and from places.
So you only have a couple of good east-west routes, and you were pointing out that Fifth North is not necessarily
It's not the best, I agree.
But it's going to change, because on the 5-year plan, we have that being punched through to 9th East, and that will then take it all the way from 9th East to, what's that? Independence Avenue, which you can't say the same, at least not very, 8th North, 7th North, they have this disconnect going on. So 5th North, right now, I drive every day, everywhere in Provo doing repairs, and so I drive the path of least resistance, and it used to be I would go 7th North. It's not anymore. I go 5th North, and then I cut up because I don't want to get snagged on all those lights. But 5th North is a collector, and often collectors, as they grow, you end up just losing parking anyway. So this is painful, but if you're going to have functional east-west routes for cars, you need it for bikes also, and if you can combine it in a logical way, kind of like we're doing with Bulldog, then you end up hopefully with a win-win. I don't know that Fifth North has the capacity, the right-of-way to do everything, and so you may end up just losing some parking.
They have, and that's all, and I get it.
We're just about, we're out of time, but a thought that I wanted to make, I appreciate it. I don't think I saw it in the presentation, but I saw it in the support documents, that kind of a parking map for this stretch of 500 North.
Yeah.
And on both sides, I've seen it from kind of the bird's eye view saying, well, there's all this parking there, but I've also experienced as a driver, like, I want to go here and I don't know where to park safely and not in someone's, someone's private lot or whatever. And so I do think that the signage and whatever we can do to help people know what the parking is, but also to use that parking more efficiently. And I know that's a big problem and it's not going to be solved overnight, but any steps we can take towards the effective use of parking. When Mr. Winterton said, well, what should I do? It's like, if there was a simple, easy, customer-friendly way to monetize that, maybe that anyway, there's stuff out there, but I'm glad you're on the job working towards improving that. The other thing, as in the video that was talked about, I think these facilities, this is actually how we're going to handle the increasing congestion. And so things like this, things like adding bike lanes, benefits drivers as well. It benefits overall because we increase the capacity of our roads when we do these things for all users, regardless of the choices that are made for transportation. So.
You reduce friction too because you separate the two uses that are going inherently different speeds. So you're not going to get as many crashes.
No other comments? Thank you very much. Appreciate the presentation. And we will move to item number 3. A discussion on the airport master plan. This will be presented by Mr. Dave Decker, the Director of Public Works, and is budgeted. Actually, Steve's. Oh, Steve, excellent. We will upgrade to Steve Gleason, the airport manager of airport operations. We've got this for 45 minutes.
Yeah.
We're running a little over, so if you could even do that at 44, that'd be great.
He's giving me the thumbs up.
We can make
so,
this happen.
Just really quickly, I gave you an update not that long ago about the master plan and where we're going. Well, the master plan is now arriving at completion, so we brought out our consultants from RS&H who are doing the master plan for us, and it will be Mike Becker and Peter Mayman. So they are the guys who have put this whole plan together. And then Dave Decker, Brian Torgerson, Trent Johnson, and Donovan Sheff, practically the whole airport staff is here also, just in case you have any other questions that you might want. So I'll turn the time over to Mike Becker.
Excellent. Thanks, Steve. All right, so just like Steve said, we're here to talk to you about the airport master plan. It's been about 32 months worth of work, and it encompasses a lot more than just the new passenger terminal. So we're going to dive deep into some of those elements. And again, Mr. Pete Maimon's in the back there, and he's the technical brains behind a lot of the stuff we're about to talk about. So as I look at him or I point over that, every once in a while I'm sure he's going to jump up and have some comments as we go. And here is our clicker. So real quick, we won't spend a lot of time on it, but just to give you an understanding of what we're going to tackle today in the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to talk about the project overview. We're going to go through the forecast of people, cars, and planes. Then we're going to talk about what those mean as requirements for facilities, how big facilities need to be, how much runway you need, etc. Talk about how we went through the alternative process and concluded on what the right preferred alternatives for your facilities were. And then kind of end this discussion of what's remaining in this master plan. And those who are curious about following along and wondering where the end is, on the bottom you see these 5 little increments that going from overview to next steps. So as soon as we get over here, presentation's done. So when we set out to do this back in 2017, Steve gave us a strong project focus of issues that we needed to get into the bottom of and come out with solutions at the end. And that was airfield hotspots, which is indicated by this round circle right here. It's an area on the airfield that has been identified as having some safety concerns and needed to be reviewed. We also talk about a new passenger terminal, which we vetted in 2017 as this would be the right spot to carry that terminal building up out of the ground and provide additional commercial service opportunities for you. Even while this master plan was going on, we needed to identify places for hangars, and while we were studying and trying to determine those, hangars were being built. So the airport is just continuously growing while we're trying to plan and identify the future for them. Your primary runway, we wanted to make sure we looked at what can we do to that facility to enhance it, to provide the best possible situation for all the pilots using the airport. Set out to justify your crosswind runway. This morning, Steve liked to tell us we failed there, and we'll discuss why we weren't able to justify keeping your crosswind, but we have a really strong solution that I think will provide the community a lot more opportunity in the future. And then what are we going to do with on and off airport land use? Let's consider what it's going to look like today as well as into the next 20 years, and then what is it going to look like in the next 40 that we should plan for. So real quick, the planning process, as you probably are all familiar with it, it starts off with pre-planning, understanding what we need to look at, what focus items, what community involvement we should have, what does the scope, the budget, the schedule need to look like. Then you move into the investigation phase where we identify your existing conditions, understand your forecast, what does that look like from planes, cars, and people, talk about our facility requirements, taking a look at every facility that's owned by the city of Provo and understanding what do they have, what is the life cycle of it, what's the condition, is it big enough, is it too small, and really get it down to the nitty-gritty of requirements. Again, in the beginning of this, we knew the terminal was a big deal, so we set off and did the terminal assessment right away and resolved that component before the project really got deep into the other elements. Into the solution phase, which everybody always says is the fun part. After the details are figured out, people figure out different options and you work through the alternatives to solve it and you come out with a preferred solution. And that leads us to where we are today, and that's the implementation phase. How much is it going to cost? How do you phase the projects into the airport to keep the airport open while you're making construction improvements? Send a set of airport layout drawings to the federal government. If it's not on an ALP, it doesn't get funded and it needs to be approved by the FAA. Then you generate a capital improvement plan and produce a set of documents that the airport leadership and community leadership can use to reference as they implement their projects along the way. So you turn that process into a schedule, and I won't drill in too deep, but here you can see the 3 years of the project and what I find fascinating in it is you can start to populate as dates as we incrementally move through the planning into the solution phase and into the implementation phase, collectively moving through those milestones to make the planning come to where we're at right now, whereas we're at the end of a long journey of work and getting to the point where you guys can now take the plan and implement it with the city council. So one other note to note, this is today, May 7th. We're here. This morning we were talking with the advisory committee. This afternoon we're talking to you guys. We're going to come back on June 19th and we're going to meet with the public and share this plan as well with them. So that's where we are. I just went through that, so we'll skip that one. So just real quickly about the aviation demand forecast, the three important parts for an airport are aircraft that are operating there, taking off and landing, aircraft that are based there, and then the people that are using it through the terminal building. So you take a look at total aircraft operations right now. The dark line indicates where you were in the past, and about 2015, 2016, you were at about 86,000 operations. We took a look at it this morning to see where you were in 2018, and you're right on par. You guys are doing really good with keeping your operations on track to where they need to be to achieve this forecast. And we expect that you'll be at about 130,000 operations by the end of the planning period. And a lot of that will be directly related to flight schools and flight operations. Duncan will make a major impact in that as well, and then commercial service activity will play a factor in increasing your operations.
Why did we drop so much?
Well, this is about the economy tank where everybody decided that they didn't have a lot of money to do much. So that was probably the biggest indicator, was just the economic recession.
That was a nationwide drop. That wasn't just us.
Was it? Did we basically mirror the nationwide?
Yeah.
And you can go into, we can go into it, but a little bit of that same time was a little bit of the pilot shortage and the change in the rules and regulations on how to train pilots, which has since changed, which is why you're seeing the fluctuation of additional pilots getting into flight training and increasing the operations now, and they weren't there. Go ahead, sir.
I'm guessing why, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, I'm looking at that and saying, okay, 2006, 2008, there's crashing. We went from 165,000, and we're projecting out at 2035 that we're only up to 130. Well, I hope we've recovered. I mean, everything else I've heard we've already recovered from the crash of 2008, and we're projecting, another 15 years out that we still haven't even got back to those levels.
It's a little hard to. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just going to say, I assume that's because a lot of that 165 were GA. And what we're replacing as we're building up is more commercial.
So it has a little bit to do with that as well. I think the important part to know is that the way people fly and use aircraft has just changed dramatically over the last 20 years. And so if you look nationwide back in the 2000s at airports, operations were much higher and they've all dropped. Price of fuel's gone up, the cost of owning an aircraft has increased. A lot of those factors have changed aviation dramatically. And so you don't see necessarily a recovery to post-recession times anywhere. You just see a rebuilding and a regrowth of aircraft operating. Steve, you want to chime in too?
Just really quickly, also the air traffic control tower made a big difference. Prior to the air traffic control tower, we were doing 180,000 operations a year. The airport was hazardous. At this point, the air traffic control tower limits the number of people in the pattern, so a lot of those flight schools will go and do their touch and goes somewhere else. So not only will we not likely get back to the 175,000 operations really soon, because they'll still go do their touch and go somewhere else, but we don't really want to.
Yeah. And that's what I would take out of this is if we're investing this kind of millions of dollars into it, I hope that we're going to gauge the outcome and the benefits to the community on something other than this graph.
Yes.
Yeah.
Agreed.
That's a good
Go ahead,
point.
Pete.
Total operations aren't necessarily an indicator of health of an airport. It's the types of operations that are ongoing out there. And at Provo, you've got the right type, the right mix that makes it for a very, very healthy system.
One operation now brings in 160 people, where before one operation did one person. And so there's a big difference.
And keep in mind, operations are important because that's what FAA bases our eligibility for a tower off of, and so anyway, they are important, but yeah, they aren't the most important.
They're way
indicator.
different.
Yeah, factors that go into the planning. And I think you'll have some positive, a couple other positive slides here that help you tell the story where you're going. Based aircraft, I alluded to this already, during the planning of what we should do with additional growth-based aircraft, we were having Steve sign leases and build hangars. So it was an exciting time to be the planner and a great time to be the airport director to have such continuous growth. And we don't see that stopping anytime soon. A lot of more based aircraft flight schools increasing their fleet mix. So we see this as a strong indicator of a healthy airport. Now, this one you may have seen before, but this is kind of talking about the actual passengers, the people part of what's happening here at Provo. And you've over time have just dramatically increased your passenger service here, and but have some limitations, which you all are aware of, and that's why you're moving forward with your terminal plan. With the current facility, it really limits and caps how many aircraft and people you can push through there. By investing into that new terminal area, you're able to continuously grow, and this is about where you would be without the new terminal. And with the growth of the terminal, you really open up floodgates of awesomeness of where passenger service and passenger potential here at your airport. So this is the big indicator of how things are going to go. Okay, so those are the three big pieces. We start to look at facility requirements. So how do you measure an airport's facilities? Well, you measure them against how many operations are growing, how many passengers, what type of aircraft are operating there, and that really triggers to the key elements that we needed to study. And so the number one is the critical aircraft. This A320 really accomplishes a lot of things. The size of this aircraft is representative of 100% of the narrow body fleet mix out there in the United States, and about 90 to 95% of the commercial fleet out there. So you really, by accommodating the critical aircraft of an A320, you're accommodating the diverse fleet that's out there that's going to potentially fly at your airport. I won't geek out on it too much for you, but the category of aircraft helps identify the speed in which they're going to operate at your airport. The design group identifies how much safety separation we need to provide for it. And the taxiway design group is really to understand how much pavement you need on the ground to move those aircraft around corners and park. So those elements are very important as we look at your facility. So airfield capacity. What is the intent of an airport is to get airplanes on the ground safely. So how many can you do? And just like any other facility out there, it has a limitation. So you currently have a crosswind configuration, which the way that operates has a cap, a service volume, the amount of aircraft that you can operate there. And it's generally about 200,000 operations you can get in on a configuration like that. In the planning world, when your operations get to about 60% of that capacity, we should be planning for a solution, and at 80%, we should be implementing that. So by the time you get to about 100%, you've already got your solution on the ground. So what's interesting here is we talked about your operations are about 85, and we expect them to go to 130. So by the end of this planning period, you're going to be in a zone where you should be making some planning decisions on what you're going to do to increase your capacity. The other point I want to point out to you guys is a one runway system has an annual service volume of 195,000, and a two runway system in this configuration only has 200,000. So you're really only gaining about 5,000 operations with your crosswinds. It's not a very efficient layout. It doesn't really offer the airport much capacity. And for that matter, it also has an intersection which decreases the, a different way to say it, offers up some additional challenges for pilots and safety concerns that we should alleviate. Make sense? Okay. So just a spoiler alert, if you had a parallel runway system, you'd have 320,000 potential annual service volume. So really doubling your capacity for aircraft. So we went down the road to figure out how can we justify the secondary runway? Well, the airfield, when you look at that, has a couple different components. One of them being about wind. You don't need the secondary runway for wind coverage, but you do need that secondary runway for the type of operations that you have here. A lot of flight schools, a lot of flight training, a lot of fast-moving jets coming in, as well as commercial. So the justification of a secondary runway is there. The justification for the location as a crosswind, making sense to crosswind, is not necessarily, isn't there. So wind coverage, need for the capacity, and then I think the traffic separation is the critical one here. You need it for the flight schools, you need it for the diverse fleet of aircraft that you have here, which justifies the secondary runway moving forward into your planning period. So we looked at the facility requirements: runways, taxiways, commercial, nav aids, utilities, aircraft rescue and firefighting, tie downs, and fuel storage. The ones with the green means you got good stuff. The facilities are in good condition. You don't necessarily need any additional, some minor tweaks to it, but it's not going to take a lot of planning analysis to review it. The orange ones show some indication that must be addressed, but more of a long-term kind of planning. And the red is right away, we need to get that figured out. And I'm telling you guys all this, and you know it because you've been living it for the last 2 years. So our alternatives focus was really on the runway, taxiway system, and then the commercial terminals and the hangars. You've had a presentation from Steve about the terminal building, so we're not going to dive into that. We're going to stay focused on the other elements, the taxiways and the runways and the hangars. And I'll take a pause here to make sure we all appreciate the process in which it goes through. So along this journey, we've had to really understand what the future might look like, what the facilities were going to be, and then really develop some solutions. Those first round solutions sometimes have holes in them or don't work with other things, and so we evaluate them against a whole bunch of criteria, and then we refine those alternatives. And that's a good place where the advisory committee has come in and helped us kind of poke holes and reconsider and look at different ways of all the different alternatives. And then we finally get to the point where we're integrating taxiway preferred alternatives with runway alternatives, with air apron alternatives, to really come together with a cohesive plan and layout that the airport can work. That integrated plan gets sent off to the FAA for approval, and with their approval, that airport layout plan comes back, and then those projects that are listed on it become AIP eligible, and really have been blessed in a sense that, yes, they will work with the National Airspace System, and you should move forward with implementing those as appropriate in your project. So your airport layout plan was recently submitted to the FAA back in April, and we are cautiously optimistic that we'll get our approval back from them before June 19th public meeting. So we're just staying in contact with the FAA to try to help that process along, and hopefully when we come back, we're able to tell you, yes, it's been approved, or it's conditionally approved, or it's almost there. But at our recent discussions with them, everything seems in line, and the FAA representatives have been along the ride with us for the last 2 years and have been very supportive of our solutions. Excuse me. So looking at the secondary runway alternative, we know we have a secondary runway that's justified, but we also understood that the capacity in this configuration doesn't offer too much. But we had some parameters. We needed a 4,000 or 5,000 foot runway so it could accommodate that small training fleet of aircraft. We didn't want to set out on a road of purchasing more land, so what can we do with what we have? We wanted to be compatible with the existing development in your surrounding neighborhoods of what we could do for a potential secondary runway. We also know that there's some strong infrastructure on the airport that we didn't want to necessarily go in and remove, like an air traffic control tower or a radar system. What can we do with what we have? And then ultimately, there's a lake and there's some environmental considerations, so let's play all that into a factor as well we come up with some solutions. So let me back up and option one on the whole equation was to do nothing. Leave the crosswind runway, the secondary runway, where it is for the period of time. Now, because of the operations that are occurring there, the FAA wasn't going to support the runway in its current width configuration. So it would need to be reduced down in size to accommodate the fleet that you have. So there would be some modifications to that runway just to move forward with it in the next 20 years. So really it became initial planning parameters and to do nothing to evaluate to do something with. And so we looked at an assortment of options and really landed on these two. And option 4A and 4B, which generally are a parallel runway, about 4,000 to 5,000 feet in length. The biggest difference is the separation between the primary runway, and this is the separation. From here to here is 700, and from here to here is about 800 feet. And you say, so what's 100 feet? And this is a planning criteria to think about over the long period of time. If the aircraft fleet mix were to continue to grow and you were to want to put a larger aircraft on the secondary runway, you would need that separation distance so that they could land on both runways. If you keep it at 700, you limit yourself to training smaller light aircraft on the one smaller runway and large on the other. So as time goes on, the considerations to understanding what your fleet mix might be changing to might lead you to a different decision. But consensus with the airport advisory board and the planning team was plan for the 800 feet, give yourself plenty of flexibility and separation so you can accommodate the growth in large corporate aircraft, commercial aircraft, and accommodate the general aviation training public. So a quick terminal area validation, site validation. As I mentioned at the beginning, Steve said right when we got started, probably even a little bit before we got started, he was like, I need to know about this terminal. We need to get on this right now. And we took our entire planning team and we focused on that right away to look at the old planning, look at the area, what was going on with commercial service, and really determine what the right location was for a growth in a commercial terminal, what was the size, shape, and location was appropriate for the growth in this community. And we determined that the area that you guys are currently designing and in the midst of heading out to eventually construct was the right spot. So all of that came out really well, and we concluded with a configuration that would work to be able to start off small and then grow as commercial service grew and your opportunities unfolded and the floodgates continued to open, you're able to accommodate that potential growth. So now we move into some more technical aviation things. It's probably not as glamorous as the terminal or runway, but just as critical from a safe operation standpoint of the airport. You have a location on your airfield that has been identified as having some concerns in the industry to try to alleviate and mitigate to make it safer in the future. There's not, as Steve had pointed out earlier, there's not a safety concern today. We've only had an incursion or two over, I think it was like 5 years ago. So it's more about design. It's more about trying to be proactive with safety than it is that we have an immediate concern. The technical aspects of it is a high energy intersection. This is connecting into the center area of two runways. If you think about how aircraft operate, they're at the fastest point in about the middle of the runway, and they're at the least ability to maneuver quickly. So if something was about to happen, an aircraft was going to pull out in front of you, the pilot doing the arrival or departure is a limited ability to deviate from that. Non-standard angles, again, it's geometry. The engineers and us all love that part to fix the angle, but it's not the appropriate angle to give a pilot the most situational awareness. Direct access to the runway, we found within the aviation industry an enormous amount of different airports that at times pilots can get disoriented off of the apron, and if they have direct access to the runway without an immediate turn, they could think they're on a taxiway but actually be on a runway, and that can present some challenges. And then multi-node, this one's straightforward. There are more than one thing going on, and so you have more than one option as a pilot, and there's a chance for situational awareness deprivation and the potential to make an error that we're all out there as airport owners to try to mitigate the safety concerns and make it easy as we can for pilots to operate and the safest for pilots to operate. So we had to figure out what to do. So this is where the the science of planning comes in, and every aircraft has some statistical characteristics. So we have studied and we do know how your fleet mix operates on your airport. Okay. So we did a lot of work to determine where your big aircraft were and your little aircraft were going to come in. And what's important to note is that we wanted to make sure that we got a majority of those aircraft so they could get off of the runway really quickly. And this is the zone. You need to put a connector right here to be able to accommodate those aircraft effectively. We needed to do that again on the other two connectors, and we determined that this is the most accurate and safe zone for these connectors and in the right configuration. So land use, perfect. I got about 5 minutes. I'm going to drive into a really important facet of what your community is concerned about. What's the land use around the airport going to look like in the next 20 or 40 years? So here's your terminal. This is where we're going to put your passenger terminals, and we're going to grow. And we're not exactly sure how well we're going to grow, but a lot of the smart people out there are thinking 1 million passengers might be where this terminal area could go. So you look around the industry and you say, what other airports have about 1 million passengers, and how big a land do we need to preserve for it? And when you look at Colorado Springs, for example, or Eugene, and you just take the footprint of what roads, parking, and terminal and apron look like, you get an area that is generally that big. So if you continue to grow, gain 1 million passengers, you're going to need to preserve the land to accommodate them at about that size of an area. Now, we've talked about how we're going to realign the runways and give yourself an additional 120,000 up to 300,000 more aircraft operations in the new configuration of a parallel runway. That would mean that your existing crosswind runway is no longer needed as an airfield piece, so maybe there's something to do there. And we're talking again 40 years out. Over the next 10 years, with your employments and the growth that you're going to see in your commercial service is really going to be telling whether or not the right place for 40 years on to build your terminal and expand your terminal, and this is the right location. Or maybe when the life cycle of this area has expired, we're talking 40 years out, building life cycles are usually about 30 or so, so there might be a need to expand it. You could expand it in that area, or maybe it's a redevelopment over here. But maybe it's not. Maybe it's another large airport compatible use, maybe another Dunkin', another bunch of corporate hangars. The future in that area is endless, and what we're trying to tell you right now is don't make some short-sighted land use decisions today. Let the air service grow here. Take note that this is your next most valuable piece of land on the airport to watch and monitor and make the right decisions when development comes. And then look at this area around the airport as compatible land use for aviation, and really from the city's standpoint to consider what the right use of that land is, if it's for airport ownership, if it's for community compatible land use development or aviation use. It's really critical to recognize that those decisions as they come to you will have a dramatic impact on the growth and development of the airport. That was real quick on the land use. You might want me to stop for a second and answer any questions on that.
How much of this, most of this is still in the private sector?
That is correct.
And so it's just, as opportunities come, you're suggesting that we look to take advantage of those, is what you're telling us then?
I think the first and foremost I'm saying is be cautious of any development opportunities that may come that aren't compatible with the airport, that this is your kind of your last frontier of expansion here, and you're going to need potentially to consider expanding here. So be aware of developing there that's not going to be compatible with the airport over the next 20 to 40 years, so you're not put yourself in a difficult position to then have to redevelop something. Secondly, yes, I think as the community or the city has the opportunity to consider purchasing land, they should consider it. Whether or not it's the right answer or not, that's really up to you guys to worry and think about. But that's the zone that is going to be most dramatically impacted by the airport.
How much of this is in our airport protection
All
zone?
of it.
All of it right now is.
All of that is in the airport protection zone. The
This-
airport protection zone is actually a little bigger than that.
Thank you.
So it lines up really well with the West Side plan that was just adopted.
So moving forward, this is the pretty graphic of what your airport is going to look like over the next 20 years. This pink is the removal of that runway. This blue is the new parallel secondary runway. Growth in hangars, growth in some MRO, growth in your terminal area, and generally a very healthy facility that can meet the flexibility as design and demand occurs. And I'll wrap it up with saying we are hoping to receive our FAA approval before June 19th, but we will be back June 19th to talk to the community at large, have them an opportunity to engage with us directly and field any particular questions. We are wrapping up the implementation, which ultimately is one of the most important parts for this board, is understanding how you phase it through, what are the costs, and how do we move through the capital development projects over a 20-year period. And then the documentation so that leadership can use the document to help them move through the demand and the facilities as they need to be implemented. And so with that, I say thank you, and I can field a couple of questions if you want, but I know I'm running low on your time.
I do have one question. I'm not sure who's the best to answer this, and I apologize. I have a very short-term memory, so if
we're good, we'll do it.
This, and we've already done it, but often with these type of plans, generally, we create a draft, we go out to the public, we get public feedback, sometimes we make tweaks to that, it comes to the council for approval, and then we move towards the implementation and whatever. Looks like the airport layout plan is already submitted, looking for approval from the FAA. I guess what's the purpose of the open house? Is it just to explain it to the public, or are you taking input?
So what we've submitted is the ALP. That's not the plan. The ALP is simply a layout of where buildings are going to go. It's what we kind of pay professionals to lay out for us. That's not something that the public input is necessarily as valuable on. What we take public input on, like last time we did our master plan, public input was directly responsible for us switching to a right-hand pattern because noise was an issue. So it's not necessarily the public telling us where we should put a box hanger versus a T hanger. That we use forecasting for. They're certainly able to give us input on that, and we can still make changes. So just because the FAA is looking at it right now doesn't mean that that's carved in stone. We made changes to our ALP all the way along the master plan over the last 20 years. But you have to start there, and you don't want to go down the public path until the FAA has said, yeah, you're on the right path. Or anything that they tell us won't matter. We're going to have to go back and satisfy the FAA anyway. But the plan is more than the ALP. So yes, there will still be opportunities for the public to give input. Like I said, last time, public input made significant changes to what we did at the airport.
Any other questions? Thank you for a thorough presentation. We can't wait for the floodgates of awesomeness to open and flow.
It's been a really fun project. We've really enjoyed the time, and it's kind of sad to see it wrapping up from the planner standpoint, but we're really excited for you guys to have the opportunities to now implement the solutions, and it'll be great to look back and see some of those things implemented and as your community is continuously growing. So thank you for the opportunity to work on your project. We appreciate it.
Thank you. We will now take a 5-minute break, which I'll remind
Hey,
you.
Dave, before you go, I'd like to thank all the people who are here from the airport for showing up. I mean, this is an important thing for us, and we appreciate you guys all being here and just being available and all the work that you do. Thank you.
Can we share names and what your role is?
I'm with.
Let's go there.
Sorry. I'm Donovan Chef. I'm over maintenance at the airport.
Trent Johnson, I'm over operations.
So those two are the ones that get happen every single day.
There's more Brian. But thank you. Anyway, thank you.
These guys do a fantastic job. Our airport people are just fantastic, and I want to tell the consultant thank you. They have done a fantastic job on the master plan, just a great job.
Dave's always at the airport board meetings, and so, you know, I mean, there's a lot of support for this. This is one of the fun things really going on in Provo in my mind, so thank you.
I'm glad you came. Mr. Gleason often talks about you too, and so thanks for coming and joining us.
They make it happen every day.
Thank you for the service you provide to our community. Thank you, Mr. Williams. I appreciate that. Okay, so now we will take a 5-minute break and remind counselors how quickly 5 minutes goes. So let's get back and keep going. which is a discussion on the potential of an aquifer storage and recovery program. This will be led by Mr. David Decker, the Director of Public Works. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about a particularly important topic. And before I get going too much on this, I want to just express my appreciation not only for the opportunity to talk about this topic, but for some key staff members that we have here. I think many of you know Jamina McKnight in the back. Shane Jones is up here. Gary Calder is actually on a field trip with several other staff members visiting wastewater treatment plants today in California, MDR treatment plants. Similar to what we are designing right now, and otherwise he'd be here. I also want to take a minute and introduce our consultant that's over our aquifer storage and recovery. Jeff Davis is here from Bar Engineering. There's a number of staff members also from Bar Engineering that have been involved with this project. I also want to make sure that you know John Schutz. John is sitting next to Shane there. John works with John Mabey, and they team up as key legal experts in our water rights, and we're going to talk just very briefly here at the beginning about aquifer storage and recovery and how that ties to water rights. I want to tell the council when I get going here on this, I am apt to get ramped up a little bit, excited about this topic. This has kind of been a long time in coming. This ties, and I think it might surprise you, but this ties a lot of things together in public works. Our wastewater treatment plant, it even ties the airport into this topic. And a lot of people will look at me and say, how on earth does this tie the airport together? And I'm hoping, but by the time we get done here, you'll kind of understand why this is such a key element for public works. I want to make sure that I've given the right. One other thing that I want to mention, and part of the reason that I'm very concerned about this topic, and it will likely take several conversations. I've asked Wayne actually to talk with council leadership about the potential need for some conversations specifically about water rights, and we'll talk a little bit about water rights here. And that's where John and John start to play a little bit more of a role in aquifer storage and recovery. But I think right now the important part for the council, for the administration to know, is that the state engineer's office has started what they call the adjudication process for water rights in Utah County. This has been going on in Salt Lake County for the past couple of years. And you may have heard, you may have relatives, you may know other people from other agencies in Salt Lake County, and they're kind of, I don't know, a couple of years into this process. Well, that process is now moving into Utah County, and the way I would summarize the adjudication, John may explain a little bit more about this, but it's basically an opportunity for the state engineer and his staff to come in and review every single water right in Utah County. And basically it's our opportunity to go back and make an accounting of the beneficial use or the potential future beneficial use of water rights that we control. And if there's a question, if there's something that comes up, or there's a reason that the state engineer might say, well, I don't know that you're really using it, or you might not use it in the future, that water right potentially could be lost either by an individual or an agency. Now, water rights are more protected on municipality side than private agencies, and even some agriculture and some other things. But even with that better protection, there still is a very high risk, and there is a risk. I won't say it's a high risk, but there is a risk, and we need to be prepared for it. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today is that preparation. John, would you add anything to that?
No, I would say it is coming to town. It's a chance for everybody who has or claims water rights to basically put up or shut up, and anyone who doesn't show up they lose their rights. It's kind of creating a clean slate going forward, trying to clean up the books. And so this is the chance where you've got to lay out all your water rights, substantiate them, and then have them blessed basically in this process, or they go away for good.
Is that a specific meeting that people attend, or?
They have public open houses, and then it's just a court case. And so you submit your claims, the state engineer looks at all those claims, says yes, no, no, yes, and then the court, basically, you have a chance to push back with the court, and then at the end of the day, the court enters a decree that lays out who has water rights and how much.
Have they got a court date, or is that?
It's coming up.
We haven't got a date yet, date specific that, I'm just wondering, I do know there's a few people on the west side that believe and think that they have water rights, and I'd like to have them involved.
So the north side of the river is in a subdivision that's already coming. They're further along in the process, actually. But south side of Provo River and then going up Provo Canyon, which is where a lot of your rights are, that's July and August of this year. That's when it's going to be commenced.
And this is only the river, or is this, because Rock Canyon's
everything?
It's all water rights.
Underground, Rock Canyon, Springs, Provo River, all of that.
So any streams that we're running through that now have not those rights, people still hold a piece of paper that think they have rights to that, but the stream is dried up and they're not using it. Those are really in danger.
There's an excuse from forfeiture if the water's not there naturally, you don't have to use it. But yes, if you've been sitting on it for the last 10 years and it was your dad's and you inherited it and no one's used it for the last 10 years, you've got problems.
Okay, good to know.
So we're going to have some more conversation. Like I said, I've made a request, and it's probably in a little bit different situation, different setting potentially, but we need to have some conversation with the council about the adjudication. We'll get a lot more detail, but I think this is a good introduction to why we're concerned and potential uses. So we're going to start the slide presentation, and the council, the more and I'm trying to be careful here with words, I hope nobody's offended, but the more senior members of the council will remember, and I don't mean that in age term, I mean that in tenure, so I'm trying to be careful there, so
more mature.
Okay. You'll recall that about 2 years ago, we spent a number of work sessions talking about water. In fact, I think there were 6 or 8 presentations that we did just on water alone. And I don't know how many of you remember, and I'm going to go back into a couple of those presentations. We're actually going to show you the same information right out of the water master plan that was approved in 2013. This is a table that talks about the potential growth in Provo City. I don't think there's any surprises on this table. Potential build out is around 200,000 people. Potentially it could be larger than that, but based on the general plan in 2013, that was what was being projected from a population standpoint. This again is another chart right out of the master plan. This was shown in the 2017, and based on those populations, they estimated the amount of water that would be used either in an average year or a dry, on this page, this is just average annual, and this is peak day production numbers. And this is in million gallons per day. This is in acre feet up here. So right now, and these are important numbers to remember, I'll write them down in just a second here, but right now we're utilizing about 28,000 acre feet of water per year in Provo City. And you can see where we're going from these projections. Now, having said that, we're in the middle of updating our master plan. We have another consulting firm, Bowen & Collins, doing an update on both our 40-year plan and our master plan. And they're actually revising these numbers slightly down. You'll remember, I'll show you a chart here in just a second. You'll remember, I hope you remember this chart. This is our water rights, and we'll come back and talk about our water rights in graphic form. But this projection is right here on this line. This is if we conserve water at the 25% goal that the state has set. This is the projected master plan use into the future. So those numbers that you were seeing on the previous page are shown graphically here. If we don't conserve water, they're saying that here's what Provo City is going to be using for water consumption into the future. And the years, you can see the years down here along the bottom of the graph.
And the whole covered area are our rights.
We'll come back and talk in just a second. This yellow line right here, we've actually added. This is not part of the master plan, but we added this on the graph because this is actually where Provo City, year by year, is using water. So it's important to note, and I'm hoping that people remember, we're actually well below what our projections are showing. And that's good news in a lot of ways. It means our residents are being responsive as far as education, conservation. There's lots of good things about that yellow line there. So again, I hope council members remember that part. Most of the rest of the presentation actually focuses on other parts of this graph. So the water rights, Mr. Stewart, that you were asking about are shown here also graphically. So in the blue, this lower part, this is our spring rights of Provo Canyon primarily and South Fork. This right here, and you can see it up here, this is our Big Springs right that was just developed a few years ago. So we've quantified each of these water rights, and you can see up here, you can look on this, how many acre feet each of those right represents. The next one up here, this is a consolidated water right for groundwater, and we're going to talk a lot today about this water right. And years ago, I think it was in 1990, like many other municipalities, Provo City consolidated their groundwater rights so that we didn't care anymore, or we could track it easier and use the water right in a variety of different wells. So water rights generally are, in a very specific point of diversion is what they call it, and you can only use a certain quantity out of that well. And the reason we consolidated our water rights is now we have 16 wells that we can put this big group of water all together, and we can pull it out of all 16 wells or one well, and we don't have to worry about the specific well. So that's why the city consolidated their water right. We also purchased another water right for groundwater. It's called the UMPA water right. It was purchased in 1990. One of the key pieces of water rights that has been purchased recently for the city, and it plays a major role. So the green area right here is represented, these are stream rights, Provo River water rights that the city has, and we're going to talk a little bit about those as well. And then there's some smaller amounts of water, Central Utah, Jordanelle Reservoir, some other things, pretty small quantities of water relative to the other water rights that we're going to talk about. So in the presentation in 17, and I get asked this quite a bit, I get asked, does Provo City have enough water into the future? And I don't know, maybe you can give me a little bit of feedback. Did I give you absolutely yes, we're fine answer? Is that the impression that we walked away with, or what impression did I leave with you?
We're okay.
Yeah, we're okay.
Hey.
I got a cautiously optimistic. Like if we continue to do things smart, we should be able to grow and have enough for our needs. But it's not something we can just forget about. We still have to actively manage.
Please.
But that means we still need to worry about recharging.
So let me, if you walked away with absolutely, we're just fine, we don't have to pay attention anymore, can I refine that answer today for you a little bit?
You've never given that answer on anything.
Nor should you. I'm glad to hear that. Because I think Mr. Harding's a little closer to the answer that I want to give. And I want to give some specific details today that will tell you why I'm cautious about water rights in the future. So this graph, this is the same graph, and this is in a dry year. So you can see, because the water rights, we have less water available. And again, this was shown in the previous presentations. If we don't conserve, even by the consultant's estimate, we potentially run out of water. So let me go back and look, just remind you, this red right here is groundwater, and this purple is the UMPA water rights. If you'll just look right here, That groundwater, the consolidated water rights, about 23,000 acre feet. The uncle water rights is about almost 7,000 acre feet. In rounded terms, and I'm going to use rounded numbers here for ease of doing the math, there's about 30,000 acre feet of water by water rights available in groundwater. Groundwater there's three key sources of water for Provo City. There's the springs, there's groundwater, and then there's surface water in a variety of settings, either Provo water or in reservoirs upstream from the Provo River water. So and these numbers, again, are in table form of the exact same information that you just saw in the previous graphic. So I'm going to go right through this. Again, table form of water rights, and I've broken these water rights down into the categories that I just listed for you. And you can see that the reservoir water, I've separated out from the Provo River, but this is all surface water, this tan color and this blue. And we're going to talk about this 30,000 acre feet of groundwater right here. So this is table information that Bar Engineering has put together. Ryan York and Shane and several other staff members have provided a lot of this information. This is on a well, you can see at the top, 5600 North well is what we call it. It's near the north end of the city, very close to the mouth of the canyon. The information goes back, you can see along the top of the graph, back to January of 1977, a long ways back. And this information in the blue right here is static water level in the well. So when the well is not running, and we'll talk a little bit about drilling wells. That's why I brought the casing that's over here on the side in just a second. But there are instruments, there's equipment put down the well inside that casing that can give us information about the water level. And when the well is not running, we take a static water level. And we take it fairly often. And you can see, the data will jump in some years. You can see in 84 and 83, we had very wet winters. The static water level was increasing in the 80s. And then you can see the periods of droughts. The thing that makes me nervous about this graph is we call this the best fit line on this data, because it varies a lot, and I admit. But this is the thing that makes me nervous right here. You can see 50, almost 60 feet of decline in that well since 1977. This is another well, same information. This is 88. This is just north of 820 north, about 800 west. I figured out yesterday, I'm slow I guess, I figured out that's why they call it the 88 well. I never figured that out before. So not as much decline on it, but it's still going down about 20 feet, a tad over 20 feet. Same period of time, this is since 86. So, and this is, again, we're going to skip this because this has got a little bit more information on it than maybe we've got time to talk about. But overall, the decline in the aquifer is a concern. This is a graphic piece of information. I'm going to have Jimmy and try to run this video for us, and hopefully this is going to work for us. But this shows, going back, it starts USGS information dating back to 1951, and it goes through the years. You can see the years, and we'll play this again so that you can see this. But as the red drought years show up in the mountains, you can see the change in the aquifer based on UGS information. And again, this is not Provo specific, but you can see as this gets deeper blue over here, we're getting more and more water into the aquifer. When it starts to lighten up like that, that's telling us that we have less water into the aquifer. And this is Mother Nature. This is how the aquifer naturally recovers water. This is how our groundwater is fed from the mountains, essentially. So as snowpack comes, and I'll show you another graphic on this, as snowpack comes, then the rocks essentially absorb the water and it gets into our aquifer eventually. And you'll see quite a bit. Anybody want to see that again?
Yes.
Let's play it one more time.
So starting in 1953.
This is 50s, mid-50s.
There's 59, there's 60 right there.
What does the red represent?
So this is drought This is dry
Mountains.
dry mountains.
It's dry now, yeah.
These are drought years. So when those mountains turn red, those are drought years that are showing up.
So are these only drought, or does it also have to do with the population growth? Is that, or that we're pulling out?
Nope, this is just drought. This is just weather-related information.
83, 84.
Yep. Yeah, look how wet the 80s were, that early 80s. Fills the aquifer back up.
What do we do when the aquifers are dry though?
Yeah. We're going to talk about that.
That's the $28,000 question, right?
Yeah. Okay.
And then went up through 2006, 2000, first to 2007.
7.
We don't have any data for the last 12 years.
I don't think we've input the data from the last
No, yeah,
10 years.
that's basically from the USGS, and so we're in the process of putting all of the last 11 years in. And so you can see, you know, there's in the 2000s, we know that we were having drought issues. And so you can see here that it's getting worse and worse and worse in those 2000s. And then we can just know that, you know, 10, 11, 12, we had good snow years. They went down a little bit, and then the last couple of years haven't built. So you would expect this to come back up.
That doesn't mean there's nothing in the aquifer.
No.
It just means that it's not increasing.
It's declining.
Declining.
And again, go back, if you don't mind going back to the slide presentation. We're going to go back to these two graphs right here. The graph, the video that you just saw, it's showing these years of increase. So when the blue is showing up in the valleys during those wet years, this is illustrated right here. The concern that I have, though, again, is you're getting blue back into the aquifer, but look at where the general trend is on the static water level in our wells. And this really becomes evident in the next slide, where they take every single one of our wells in a map form right here, and you can see these totals. This is essentially where the water is this a 5-year or a 2-year? Probably a 2-year. So this is where the water travels to the Canyon Road well right there. That's 2 years. So it takes 2 years from water to travel to that point and get sucked out of the ground right there. But that's the total decline in that well right there. Most every single one of our wells is showing around 20 feet decline, either since the mid-70s or since it was initially drilled. And again, you can see at the far north end, 58 feet on the 5600 North well, 58 feet of decline in the aquifer. So, and this is the south end of the city. Again, same wells. You can see most of them. Some of them don't have a lot of use. These are wells. If Ryan was here, Ryan's not here. Ryan really ought to be here, but several of these wells are not utilized very much, particularly in the southeast corner. We've got a variety of issues, but again, you can see the wells that are used. Most of them are declining about 20 feet on the average. So, let me tell you, there was one other point that I was going to make before I went there, and I hope it comes back to me because it was important. So, one of the things that the reason that I'm concerned about this, let me tell you a couple of reasons. There's a couple of dangers about declining aquifers, and this is a little bit of an extreme example. This comes a picture that comes from California, from the San Joaquin Valley. It's up in the Fresno area. I think Bakersfield's a little bit further south in the valley, but they rely a lot on groundwater. And you can see this is a famous picture, at least in Public Works. The ground in 1925 was at that sign at the top of that pole right there, and you can see the picture was taken in 1977. So even today, there is about a foot, on average, about a foot per year of ground subsidence in that valley. And again, this is a little bit of an extreme example, but the thing is it's showing up in Utah. This is a picture and some news articles that came out 2009. This is very close to Cedar City. It's a place called Enoch City. I think it's in the next valley over. I know Cedar City's struggling with the same type of an issue. It is starting to show up in Utah. And this is just ground subsidence. This is because we're taking enough water out of the ground that there's a little bit of support. I don't want to give the impression that we're sitting on a swimming pool, because we're not. That's not what I'm talking about here. But there is some support provided in those in that aquifer, and when we suck out enough water out of the aquifer, there is a potential for some subsidence to occur. It's important to understand where our aquifer, how our water gets into our wells, and why we drill wells in the first place. And this is a little bit of an example that I was trying to describe before, where snow in the foothills will naturally melt either in the foothills themselves or travel in streams down into the foothills of the city. And we're trying to get water to go underneath levels, and these clay and sand and gravel layers are actually formed from Lake Bonneville. So this is going way back in geology time frame for most of the Wasatch Front. But our wells generally have to penetrate several layers of clay. We actually want to get into these lower levels because we don't want to have this type of an illustration where contamination on the surface can actually get into our drinking water. And so we generally want to penetrate some of these clay layers, and they call that a confined aquifer, so that there's a protection measure, a natural protection measure for our groundwater so it doesn't get contaminated. But it's important to realize that those clay layers, as you get to the foothills of the mountain, they actually curve up just like the valley floor does right now. And if we can figure out, and again, just like Mother Nature, she's putting water into these layers down here. We're trying to get underneath those clay layers like this so that it fills the aquifer instead of just shallow groundwater, which can cause problems for basements and other things. You see that in very wet years, and that's because it's in that upper level, and it really doesn't help us from an aquifer standpoint. So this is kind of leading where aquifer storage and recovery really starts to go. And I'm going to skip this. I may come back to it for just a second here. But this is the introduction to aquifer storage and recovery. So the idea is to kind of mimic what is happening naturally with our aquifers. And so we need to find locations, whether generally it's in the foothills, but we need to find locations where we can put basins in gravel pits, gravel areas where there's lots of water that can get sucked naturally into the ground and hopefully get to the locations. And again, it's not illustrated on this diagram very well, but there's usually a clay layer that we want to get underneath, so it has to get deep enough. We have to get sometimes 200-300 feet down to get that water into the right aquifer. There's also some other methods to use aquifer storage and recovery. So again, this is a picture of one. Is this a local one, Shane, or is this just one that we picked out? This is probably not a local one. The only example that I can think of right off the bat in the mouth of American Fork Canyon in North Utah County, there is a similar basin that they sometimes use up there. It's not always full of water, but they have tried to use a basin similar to that. And by the way, before I skip too far, this study was done, the date on this study is 2012, August of 2012. And this is a North Utah County aquifer study done by Hansen, Allen, and Luce. And this study was prompted by exactly the thing that we're talking about. And it's interesting to read that this study on average found in North Utah County that the wells were dropping about 20 feet between 1984 and the year 2004. It's almost exactly the data that we are seeing in Provo City. It's also important to understand that partly, not completely, but partly, the state engineer took some action based on that report and made some changes on water rights. So previous to that report, you could take a water right that was surface, like an irrigation share. So if somebody had an irrigation ditch and the city or somebody owned an irrigation share, the city could go in and make a change application to the state engineer and change it to groundwater. After this study was concluded, that option was taken off the table. The state engineer does not allow North Utah County, in fact, north of the river, just like John stated, north of the Provo River, you cannot make a change application anymore for surface water to groundwater. And it's because they're concerned that groundwater rights have been over allocated. One of the key things that this study looked at is how much snow, how much precipitation happens up here in the mountains, and they can determine in rough numbers the amount of water on an average annual basis gets into the aquifer, and then they look and say, well, how many wells are drilled into that aquifer and we're taking water out? And if we got too many water rights that are trying to take water out, we've over allocated our aquifer. And that's the basic assumption here.
So the one at, 5600 north that went down 58 feet or so, is that because we're drawing it out too fast, or somehow it's not going in like it used to?
Probably a combination of both.
And do we know the exact areas and questions so that we can address the leakage, as it were, and know where to put it in and recharge it?
So that's going to be the result of their final report to us. We've actually engaged them. There's 3 phases of an aquifer storage and recovery that we're doing. Bar Engineering is actually doing phase 1 and part of phase 2. Phase 3 is actual implementation of some projects that would start to recover our aquifer, if you want to look at it that way. But my hope is within the next couple of months, we will have a report that comes back and identifies specific areas where projects could be put and potential water rights that could be utilized for recovering that aquifer. Please.
Could you skipped over the precipitation slide, but could we just take a quick look at it? I think it was earlier.
This one?
There we go.
Yep.
So that is, okay, winter.
So this is winter precipitation, and this is data, this gathered at BYU, is that where
So
the data
blue,
is?
The solid blue is all, the whole, wait, so winter is the annual is the solid blue? Oh, okay. Yeah. So that's I'm curious about the relationship between snowpack and rain, because from what I understand, a lot of the climate models I've seen talk about increased rain but decreased snow.
Yeah, that's correct. So this doesn't reflect in this particular one. But that is correct.
Yeah. And I'd just say anecdotally, when I got hired at BYU in the late 90s, I think I probably read, a colleague of mine who's a scientist gave me an article in the early 2000s predicting what you're seeing here. Anyway.
So
it's pretty sobering.
So the one thing before I get too far in, I need to go back in the slide presentation because I think this is the point that I missed with the that I wanted to make on this graphic. And so we talked about these 2 groundwater rights right here. They add up to about 30,000 acre feet. And you have to realize that our annual use, I told you, we annually right now we use about 28,000 acre feet of water. We use about 15,000 of it comes from those spring rights right here, and about 15,000 of it comes from those groundwater rights right there. So the point that I think that I'm trying to make with that illustration is we are only using about half of our groundwater rights, and this is what's happening to our aquifers. So if we went to the point, and this is why I'm nervous about this graph in the master plan, is because if we really say we're going to use 30,000 acre feet, because that's what this is illustrating in this graph, is as growth happens in Provo City, we're going to start to drill more wells, take more water out of the aquifer. If we draw more water out of it, we're only drawing half of our water rights right now in groundwater. What's going to happen to the groundwater decline? And that's why I want to revise my response to the council, to the administration about we need to be very, very cautious about this. Please.
So after hearing this, I would revise my response. It looks like we're okay in the short run, but we've got a potentially very big problem in the long run.
Well, it's the reason for the rest of the presentation.
Question, why do we use the wells instead of using the other water?
So there's a couple of different things. Sometimes we have limitations on the surface water, especially in drought years. Deer Creek, we've struggled to get any water in Jordanelle. So as our conversation about water rights goes on, you'll start to understand why water in Jordanelle is so important to me. Because we're almost utilizing our full supply out of Deer Creek. Now, in some good years, we have some carryover. Again, if Ryan was here, we sometimes get 4,000, maybe 6,000 acre feet of carryover water. But in the last 10, 15 years, and I can actually show you this data, there's only been, I think, 3 or 5 years that we have got our full allocation in Deer Creek. So in 2011, we had a really good water year. In 2017, we had a really good water year. This year, I suspect that we'll get our full allocation, but every other year than those 3 that I can remember, we have got some diminished amount of water allocation out of Deer Creek. And that water can be utilized for other purposes, but eventually we're going to get to the point where Jordanelle starts to play a much bigger role in Provo City's future.
I've always understood that we use the well water because it doesn't need to be treated.
Okay, so there are some other reasons. So the first one is some years we have diminished use, okay? There is a water quality that you're talking about. So in our springs and our wells, the only thing that we do for treatment is chlorination. The water quality is so high, and it's a big plus for Provo City. It's only chlorination. There are some cost issues, and we need to be careful about that. So spring water is the cheapest water by far. It's coming out, it flows in by gravity. We only have to pump it once it gets into our main and our gallery reservoirs. We have to start to pump it up the hill, but that's the first time spring water is ever pumped. So to get it out of the groundwater, if you're talking about groundwater, you have to pump it right from the get-go. So it costs a little bit more than spring water. Surface water is another ramp up because you have to go and treat it. And right now we're paying Central Utah Water to treat that water.
So we've used the cheaper water and it's diminished our aquifer. Is that a bottom line?
Well,
somewhat.
It's probably, yeah, it's one of the results, yes.
One of the results, okay.
Yep, please.
So how low, I mean, if you're down 5 feet, 10, 20 feet, maybe that's, but it's on a relative basis. How low can you go before it's a really big problem? I mean, 100 feet, 200 feet, how do you measure the diminished capacity of our groundwater?
Well, the concern that I have with this is that this indicated 20 feet of decline in North Utah County, and there was some action taken by the state to prevent, further water actions. That's what I'm immediately concerned about is, what do we see from state regulators because of declining aquifers?
And also, how far would they have to decline before we would see settling?
I don't know that we can answer that question. I'm not sure that we're even going that route. I'll tell you right now, my objective with this is we need to start a process of getting an artificial recharge in the aquifer, and we need to do it fairly immediately. We need to move quickly on it. And by the way, this is not a new concept. This is a report that I pulled out of the Public Works Library. I'll pass it around. You'll note the date on it, 1978. So Carl Carpenter and their firm, clear back in the 70s, were saying this is going to be a potential problem, and this is where you can recharge it. I don't know, Cliff, if you want to pass that around, but this is not a new concept, and we haven't really done anything about it for 40 years now.
Dave, as you talk about the aquifer, is this just a Provo issue, or does it, when you're recharging the aquifer, who are we recharging it for?
So I'm going to run out of time, I can tell already. So we're going to talk about travel time and artificial recharge. The aquifer takes a surprising number of years for water to move through the aquifer. We have a video that we'll show you here in just a second. But I think it's important to understand the concepts that we are exploring with VAR engineering, and we have a number of good options. So we've asked them to look at not just, they call it settling basins, like at the gravel pit of Provo Canyon. It's one of the sites that we're looking at. Do we just put water there and let it soak into the ground? And does it really get into the aquifer? One of the other things that's happening outside of the state of Utah, there's only one place in the state of Utah that I know this is happening, and it's called in-stream flow. And we have had an opportunity the last couple of weeks to pick up data in Slate Canyon and Rock Canyon, and I want to show you what we're seeing in those two canyons. So I walked this a week ago yesterday, so April 29th, I actually parked right here, walked down this trail right here. And I apologize for the poor video here. I was concentrating on not stumbling over rocks more than the video. So, but I want to show you let's go back to the, now we spoiled it. I want to show you up at the top, most of you know Rock Canyon, there's a gate on it. I think it's a green gate, green painted. Just above that gate, this is the first video, and it's just barely above this gate. So let's show the first video.
I wondered what that white thing was when I was running that trail.
And that was public works, sorry. So we put a flume in the channel, and it's so that we can measure the amount of water coming down during spring runoff. There's a gauge in it. There's going to be a couple of gauges in it. Go ahead and play this video. But this is just me taking it, and my estimation of this, we were in the 3, maybe even 4 cubic feet per second. That's about just a tad over 2,000 gallons per minute, maybe even 2,500 gallons a minute. I don't have the exact data on it, but that's how much. Would you show the second video? This is another view of that same flume that we installed. So this is just a close-up of it, and it gives you a little bit better perspective about how deep the water is in that. It's not a couple of inches. I actually measured it, and we were somewhere in the 5 to 6 inches of water going through it in the smooth areas of it. So we had a lot of water going through it. Now let me show you the third video. So I walked down to Rock Canyon Park in the stream bed where this water would normally go through the park if we had enough water going in it. And this is the video that I took. So there's the park. There's the stream bed. And we're going to cut this short because it takes me 2 minutes to walk up the stream before I actually finally find some water. So Jimmy's helped skip this along here a little bit.
When's the last time you saw water in there?
We can probably track it.
I have a hilarious picture I should share that I took higher.
I regularly report where the water is as it's coming.
So I actually turn around, there's some mud. I can tell flow was down there, and if you look really carefully, there's some water right there. There's a little bit of water right there. Anyway, the point that I'm making is the water that was coming through that flume disappears within about 2/3 of a mile. About 3,500 feet in the mouth of that canyon, all the water is gone. And we have natural abilities. We have maybe unique natural abilities in Provo, in both Slate Canyon and in Rock Canyon, and probably some other locations where we can actually get water, in natural or artificially and recharge the aquifer. And that's kind of the purpose of their study. So let's go back to the slide presentation. And I apologize.
Are you talking about other water other than the water that's running off?
Exactly.
We could dump it high enough up that it would soak down it.
Exactly. So it's important to understand that's the natural recharge that we're viewing in those videos right there. That's the spring runoff. And we're not changing, we're not altering, we're not going to change what we're talking about there. But there are water rights right here identified in this tan area that are not being fully utilized right now. And this is where the conversation about water rights needs to take place, and we don't have enough time to talk about it. But this water could be diverted in out of Provo River. We have a couple of diversions, and with some projects, we could actually pump it to the mouth of the canyons to the point high enough that we could artificially put it back into the stream and let it run down the stream. And if we match the rate that we were putting water, that you're seeing in that video right there, about just a tad over 2,000 gallons a minute, you actually would never inundate the park. The park would never see this, and that's the goal. We don't want it to run down to the park. We don't want it to run into the storm drain. I want it to run into the ground. And we need to find locations where we can take some of these water rights and put it into the ground and do it on a consistent basis. Every single year we need to fill this, because this is where we're going to make a difference for Provo City in the drought years, where you see that red show up in the mountains. We've got the water stored from previous wet years already in the ground.
So we used to have one or two canal companies on the foothill. I don't know if they're still completely active or how much they're using, but it would be interesting if that was not being used for any particular purpose, to just take it and put it in.
We've actually already had a conversation with the East Union Canal Company, and one of the concepts that we're looking at is utilizing their irrigation canal during the wintertime, because they don't use it during the wintertime, and we have water available out of the Provo River in the wintertime, and we could divert it in those canals and then pump it to the mouth of the canyon. Slate Canyon, Rock Canyon, same concept.
Well, page 20 says it would cost $1,400,000 to do.
In 1978 dollars.
So it'd be several million at least.
40 years. It would be a lot of money.
Okay.
Let me see if I think I'm out of time. So I think just to recap, this is kind of what we're trying to do: replenish declining water levels. We're trying to capture and utilize our Provo River water rights, fully utilize them. And let me make it clear, there's some projects that we're talking about. Our wastewater treatment plant may eventually play a role. We are talking about potentially putting what we call an advanced treatment plant adjacent to, or someplace in the city, where we would treat potentially have to treat Provo River water. Now, the reason that becomes an issue, and I'm going to skip ahead here, the reason that becomes an issue, we've already started with our consultant and part of our team visiting with some of these state agencies. From time to time, you'll hear about ASR projects being regulated by the state, and they're highly regulated. Putting water into the aquifer, we don't want to mess up the environment of the aquifer. There's certain things happening, and we don't want to just carelessly do something to the aquifer. So they regulate water quality, they'll regulate quantity, lots of things, and we've already started that conversation. And the reason that the treatment plant, and I'm not talking about the wastewater treatment plant, I'm talking about a water treatment plant now, and it would likely be a small treatment plant, but we may have to treat water to drinking water standards before we put it into the aquifer. I don't know the answer yet on that, but that's part of the study, is we're taking samples from each of the streams and the Provo River, and we're going to do side-by-side comparisons of pH and temperature and all kinds of regulatory chemicals that may affect our ability to put it into the aquifer, because they're going to ask us those questions.
So what we would put in would have to be at least as good as what's going in naturally.
Yes. I would venture to say yes.
Even though, isn't the aquifer providing itself some sort of...
There's some filtration that goes on, because I think when we take the water samples from like Rock Canyon, I think the fact that there's people there's animals that walk up that trail, you're going to see some bacteria counts as a minimum. In that water. It's probably not going to meet drinking water standards per se. But I think overall, it's a pretty high-quality water still. And the question is how does that water quality compare to the Provo River water that we're talking about potentially pumping up and utilizing? And that's going to be the key question. That's what they're going to ask us. I think I'm out of time here. This is just an example of, this is a cross-section, and I probably have illustrated this in two simplistic ways, but these areas right here where this tan line shows up, these are areas where we're actually drawing water out of the aquifer. So we have screens in these different wells. So this is the Foothill, this is Rock Canyon, BYU well 88, and this is showing how the aquifer plays out because we've got enough geologic information at each of these wells. We can actually tell where the gravels are and where the sand and the clay is. And so when you drill a well, and this is small, this is only I think it's an 8-inch screen size, but that is the type of screen we put, sometimes up to 1,000 feet of that into the ground. Now some of it's solid, in fact most of it's generally solid, but when you find gravels and areas where water can travel in the aquifer, you put the screen just like that in it. And then you will weld those casings all the way to the surface and then drop the pump inside that casing. And when that pump is running, the water's running like where I'm standing right here. It would be racing toward this screen, going through the screen, getting caught into the pump, and then shot to the surface in a pipe. And that's how we're getting water. That's how we get groundwater for drinking. So that's a quick summary, and you can see these white areas right here. This is where screens are illustrated in these locations in those different wells. So that's where we're getting our water from those different wells. I think that's the end. One other thing that I will illustrate, aquifer storage and recovery is not just going to benefit Provo City. The wells in the area around us will also benefit, and we need to have a conversation with the state engineer about what they call water banking. It's part of the focus. The reason that we have John Mabey and John Schutz here is because we want to make sure that we're getting some credit if we're putting water rights that belong to Provo City. We need to make sure that we're getting the water, and there's no way, there's not really a correct way to be able to say, hey, every single drop that we put in artificially is going to come back up one of those wells. So there's going to be some other people that benefit from this. Central Utah, Orem City, Springville, there's likely going to be some benefits elsewhere. And I look at it and say, I think that's a good thing. I don't look at that as a negative. I think there's some conversations, there's some details that need to be worked out, but it's a good thing to make sure that the community as a whole is benefiting from this project.
So if they wanted to come back and say, oh, you're not using this Provo River water, you say, yes, we are. We're putting it back in.
That's part of the adjudication that we need to talk about. Is we have a plan. There is a good beneficial use for that water. I think I've covered this, and I think I'm out of time too. So I think unless there's any other questions, I think we'll save the rest of the conversation for another time, and probably the 21st if we can get it arranged. But unless there's any other questions, you can see why I'm concerned about this. It's a key piece for Provo City and very key long term. So
are these slides available?
We can make them available. Yep. I think the council staff has them.
We need them anyway for the minutes. Thank you.
We'll publish them in On Base, but if you'd like me to email them to you, let me know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I just want to say that the council members should stay around as long as Dave Decker does get an engineering degree at the end of your service as a council member. So thank you for waiting patiently and staying with rapt attention on what we're talking about. This is pretty deep stuff, and we're appreciative of your time and attention.
Yeah, this is deep stuff, no pun intended.
No pun intended.
It's pretty detailed information, and I appreciate your willingness to kind of understand the basics behind it, because it's a big part of the future for water, especially.
David, one of the things I appreciate about you is your proactive approach, rather than just telling us everything's okay, which we've been told in the past, by the way. You say it really isn't okay, and there's things we can do to make it better. It's really wonderful. Thank you.
We need to move on this. We need to make some differences. So thank you. Thanks for your support too.
Thank you. All right, item number 5 is a discussion on a parking reduction on an affordable housing project. To be presented by Mr. Robert Mills, Provo City Planner.
Good afternoon, everybody. Not sure, Anna, do you have anything to bring up?
I don't see anything.
I know that there were things in your packet, so I'm just going to kind of give a brief.
I can pull from the packet.
Yeah, if you want to bring up the packet, that would be helpful. We have an applicant that recently submitted an application for a housing project down in the Spring Creek neighborhood. In conjunction with this application, they are submitting an application for a zone change to go to the medium density residential zone to allow for 4 16-plex condominium dwellings. So a total of 64 units. And one thing that we've communicated with them and we've noticed in this process is that they will have a problem with parking. The parking requirement for multifamily like that at the current time in our code requires 2.25 stalls per unit. They have 2-bedroom units, so they require 2.25 stalls. When you do the math, for 64 units, this specific project would have a requirement of 144 stalls. The applicant has expressed concerns about that, given that they have developed other projects in other areas of the city, or not of the city, but of the county. They have 2 projects in Orem that they have done where they have documented that 2 stalls per unit has more than adequately covered their parking requirement. And so that's something that they're seeking to do here in Provo. Currently though, our code does not have a mechanism to allow something like that. We have a mechanism in our off-street parking section that allows for a reduction in off-street parking based on a parking justification study, but it's very, very limited. It specifically precludes, if you look at this section right here, shall not be used to reduce parking requirements for residential uses. So at the time, the authors of the code did not want to extend those same allowances to residential uses for whatever reasons. And so in talking with the applicants and talking with some of our council members at the neighborhood meeting, we were wondering how we could do this. One suggestion, one mechanism that we could do is to amend our ordinance to remove those specific sections that disallow parking reductions for residential uses. That way, an applicant can apply for a conditional use permit through the Planning Commission to reduce the parking down to 2 stalls or whatever it might be, based on the justification for parking for that specific project. This would not be a glossed over type of thing. It would be an individual basis that the Planning Commission would have discretion based on the information that the applicants provide of whether or not it would be justified. That's one possible solution. I'm not sure of others, but we just wanted to come and bring that to the council. I know that Councilmember Connect had some had some interest in this particular project, wanted me to come and kind of talk to you about one of the hurdles that we're facing and maybe just get some direction from the council.
And they're only short
Yeah,
6 or...
So in this particular case, the applicant is able, on the existing site, is able to provide 130 parking stalls. Because of the requirements for landscaping, all of those types of things. So that works out to slightly over 2 stalls per unit. So you get a ratio of 2.03 instead of 2.25. If the applicant were to meet the standards that we currently have, they would need to reduce their the number of units to 57 currently. I'm not an engineer or an architect by any stretch of the imagination, but just based on the type of building that they're proposing, basically you would lose 2 floors of units from one of the buildings. So you would actually reduce by 8 based on the structure. You can't just take off 7, you'd have to reduce by 8. Yes.
Every time we've reduced parking, we've been burned. Every time. So why would we do this?
Well, hold on. If you're talking like Walking Village where you knock it to half, or start a crossing where again it was half, that's pretty drastic. Here, this is not a big percentage change.
So why do we have the requirement there anyway if it's not reasonable?
One size doesn't fit all, George. And when they can show that their particular product with how they manage their parking, where they assign 1 space per unit and the rest is shared, whereas a lot of condos assign 2 per unit, the people don't use all 2, but they don't share them, and then they have a parking problem.
This is your neighborhood and you're okay with it?
Yeah.
I would say in this particular case, the ratio still allows for 2 spaces per unit. These are 2-bedroom units that are customarily geared toward younger married couples prior to having children, according to the applicant. The applicant is here if you have any specific questions for them, but
So I had a question. This is an affordable housing project, right? I was wondering if there is a tendency to have a slightly lower parking ratio need in an affordable housing project. I don't know if that's the case, but it seemed like it would make sense that maybe there wouldn't be quite as many cars because of the economics.
I think there's an economic ratio. I think that there's a family status type of dynamic that's happening there. Again, that's information that I don't necessarily have, but the applicant might be able to help if you like.
With Startup Crossing, I think we saw that many married couples come with 2 cars. And my understanding of the justification of the 2.25 was 2 bedrooms, 2 cars, and then you need some for guests as well. So, you know, I think there's some justification for the 2.25, and so I think it will be helpful to have, you know, a review, and I support this. But I think a good thorough review, looking at if it's justified. I'm also hopeful. I don't know if it's in here or if it's in other places in our code, but I like the proactive approach where if you propose things that should reduce your overall parking demand, then that makes it more likely that you can get these allowances.
Correct.
You know, whatever. There's a whole list of ways that a property owner can reduce the parking demand, and so I don't know if that's part of this, or if this is just like justify it to us, or if it's also propose ways that you're going to mitigate it.
Right, and I think that's a really good point, Councilmember, that a justification study has to have tangible evidence of why those particular elements are going to help reduce that parking demand. So I think that's a really good point.
I think Gary was next.
Well, go ahead.
So we do have, I mean, if we were to have a study, it would be based largely on what they have constructed in Orem. But as part of considering this, you know, we talk about startup crossing. It's got 100 units. Does it have 200 cars? I don't think it does. I mean, it has too many cars. Maybe it's 150. But actually figuring out how many cars ended up coming to that would help us gauge what's going on in Provo right now.
Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that Startup Crossing's parking ratio is well below
0.75.
I mean, it's below 2.25 and actually below 2 stalls per unit.
Well below.
Yes, it's 100 units, and they provided 75 parking spaces. That's correct.
And so the idea is, yes, it's under parked, but not. But what you were saying is you know, there's too many cars for the stalls provided. That it's not, perhaps that's not 2 cars there per unit.
Exactly. So knowing what's really going on is helpful.
Could be, yeah. If we could find that out, I think that would be very helpful. Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. We will move to item number 6, discussion regarding enacting a free expression ordinance. And
Camille has had a family medical emergency and had to go up to Salt Lake today, so I'm going to take this one. So let me give you some past history about this. I'm glad Scott's here. And in fact, one of my notes here was to mention to the mayor and Wayne that when the council gets ready to consider this, I think it's really important that the relevant department directors are here to present some information so the council can actually make some findings of fact about why this is necessary. So let me give you some past history. So we have had, over the past several years, multiple occasions where department directors have expressed some serious concern about public use of the exterior of their facilities in a way that impacts the residents and patrons of their facilities. And this has ranged from things like petition gathering to demonstrations or other expressive activities. And the conflict arises from a public perception that everything that taxpayer funds built is public property and therefore accessible to anyone, and the actual status of the law, right? So so just to give you a really quick legal primer, there are some U.S. Supreme Court cases that particularly deal with sidewalks, and the difference between based on the names of the cases, what are called Grace sidewalks and Coquinda sidewalks. Now, in the public mind, a sidewalk is a sidewalk, right? But according to the U.S. Supreme Court, sidewalks that are adjacent to streets are public sidewalks and are therefore public forums or public fora, and can be used for any expressive activity that doesn't, inhibit traffic or use of the sidewalks, right? But sidewalks that go from a parking lot to a building, even if the building is a public building, those sidewalks are not public fora, and they are designed for the patrons of that facility to access the building. They're not designed to be used as a public forum. But we have a very vocal group of citizens that think that they are and want them to be used that way. And Scott, I don't know that we have time in this meeting, but I hope you'll be. I know Scott has a whole list of evidence from his own staff about his facility in particular. I know that Jane Nelson has concerns about the library as well, where there have been patrons of those facilities that have been harassed and followed and obstructed in their ability to use those facilities based on expressive activity that's happening on the sidewalks that are not actually public sidewalks around those facilities, okay? So that's the background. Now, because of attempts over the past few years for Provo City to actually enforce its own policies about not opening up those areas to public activity, there was some of those who were vocal about this went and sponsored a bill, and there was a bill in the 2018 session that it's not actually in effect, it goes into effect later this month, that prohibits cities from passing regulations or enforcing regulations that restrict expressive activity on public grounds. Now, in a very legal technical sense, we don't believe that bill even applies to the kinds of areas that we're talking about, like the sidewalks in front of the rec center and the library, for instance, because by its own definitions, they shouldn't be considered public grounds. But one of the things that we've run into is our police chief is very concerned about having his officers sued for a civil rights violation. So he doesn't want to be he doesn't want his officers arresting people without clear guidance that's just and what the city council wants and what city ordinances actually support. So what you have in front of you is, and that's going to come to you, it's intended to come in front of you next week, or next council meeting, the evening meeting, is an ordinance that states that Provo City will comply with the state law, and that specifies that these particular sidewalks that we've just talked about are not public grounds under the definitions of state law, and authorizes the mayor to establish policies restricting expressive activities on those areas, and to delegate such authority to the department directors who control property that might be affected. And just by way of illustration, I want you to think about, as far as the necessity of this, this is kind of the worst case scenario. A couple of years ago, some of you may remember, I went to New York City for a conference on legislative drafting. And it happened to be around spring break, so I took my teenage son with me. And we arrived in New York City. First night, we went to our hotel, we decided to go out to get something to eat, and we went up to Times Square. And I had been there before, but it had been a few years since I had been there. And I discovered that one of the things that had changed since the last time I was there is when we walked into Times Square, at 2 or 3 or 4 different locations in Times Square, there were areas where the city had painted a green line in a box around part of the property in Times Square, and those green boxes were designated as free expressive activity zones, where you could engage in basically any expressive activity that you wanted to. Well, to my son's startlement, at least 2 of those areas were occupied by females who were wearing nothing but body paint bikinis. They had literally no clothes on, and they had bikinis that were body painted on. Well, my son about had a heart attack, and if you mention New York City to him now, he nearly has a PTSD episode. So anyway, the point of telling that story is that some people will say, some members of the public will say, we're just trying to elevate public awareness about some beneficial issue. But the thing that you need to understand about free activity is that wherever you allow free expressive activity, you have to envision that the worst possible thing you can think of will take place there. Because if you allow one thing, you must allow anything as far as expressive activity goes. So I think that's everything that I wanted to express, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So if the sidewalks are differentiated in front of the rec center, what about somebody just stepping off the sidewalk onto the lawn?
So the park is a public forum. Okay, so
right, there's green space, I think, surrounding the building on the east side or whatever.
And that kind of space would not, by default, be a public forum. And again, what this does is it allows the mayor to designate actual policies and to have the department directors. Now, speaking in the meetings that we've had, my understanding is that if this is passed, that at least our parks director and our library director intend to put forth policies that designate everything they actually have control over as a non-public forum. But the sidewalks adjacent to the streets would still be public fora, and with regard to the rec center, the park itself would still be a public forum. So there's, and again, if you look at, one of the things we talked about in our meetings is we contemplated at one point actually giving a map of the city that showed every public sidewalk. I mean, we've got miles of public fora in the city, right? But it's the feeling, I think, from, and I don't know if you want to let Scott speak with our time, but it's my understanding that we've had patrons who have expressed serious concerns. We've had complaints about, I think we've had one about a mother who was trying to get out of the rec center with a stroller, and the petitioners were grabbing onto the stroller and not letting her even get to her car, right? And those kinds of things are not what are contemplated for the patrons of our facilities, I think. Councilor Handley.
Does it make more sense to just mark off the areas? I mean, maybe you are saying this, but your example with New York kind of threw me, because why not just mark off the areas that are prohibited and leave it at that, rather than say this little circle here is where you can stand and scream, but everywhere else. Because if it's true that all the sidewalks are public spaces, well then we can't actually circumscribe it too narrowly.
So the problem, without getting into too much into the weeds, the problem with New York City is I think basically all of Times Square is a public forum, but because traffic has to get through there, they have designated free speech zones that they are allowed to. Because it's not that you can't pass any restrictions on public fora. It has to be a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction.
Well, then
right?
That's very helpful. It just seems to me that, it seems like the reasonable compromise. I can understand, if we get too draconian about this, that you can really unsettle the citizens by saying, you can't ever express anything in any location where you might actually be seen or heard, right, or have a symbolic impact, right? I mean, that's what people are thinking of when they're thinking of these locations. But if there's a way to sort of compromise and say, you can do that in these spaces around the rec center, but you've got to allow, movement in and out of the rec center, and or the library or whatever it is. Is that kind of where you're guiding us, or?
Well, it is in the sense that there's a couple different options, right? One option is to get really specific about that, and we had an internal committee that debated that, and we spent quite a bit of time about debating whether what we actually wanted to bring to the council was an ordinance that spelled out every single one of those areas and exactly what the restrictions were. The default, and what we brought instead, is simply an ordinance that recognizes what the state statute says, that says that it's the city's intent to follow it, and that allows the mayor to designate policies with regard to those areas that are not legally and technically public fora. And so again, with respect to the logistical practical impact with respect to the rec center, for example, is that the sidewalk along 5th North and the sidewalk along 2nd West are public fora and would not have any restriction placed on them, and the park itself is a public forum. But the sidewalks in front of the building itself, I think the intent at least would be to designate those as specifically for the patrons of the facility and not to be used for expressive activity. And the problem is, and it goes back to this worst example thing, right? Is if you say, well, we really do want people who, if somebody's out gathering a petition for, the
against BRT.
But I was going to say something like for the
that's where it came from.
For the Grandmother Assistance Fund, right? Yeah. You say, we really want those people to be able to have the widest possible audience, right? But just recognize that if you do that, you're granting the exact same audience and the exact same exposure to our citizens to, things that.
The Anti-Grandma Association.
Yeah, the Anti-Grandma Association. And much worse things that I won't mention in this meeting, right? That we talked about in committee meeting.
One other thing, Brian, expressive behavior has also been interpreted by the courts as panhandling, as long as it's not aggressive. We can prohibit aggressive panhandling. But you can understand, there's a very fine line as to what people perceive as aggressive panhandling. And that's one of the things you allow if you allow expressive activity areas. Now, again, that's not saying that's bad, just saying that that's among the uses that could be made for those locations. So again, we just have to understand the size of the box that we're talking about here.
So Brian, are we going down the road a little bit? I think Colorado's passing an ordinance that any public property is campable now, and homeless can just, are we?
Well, this is kind of a response to a state law that was kind of headed in that direction, right? I don't know that that was foreseen as a consequence of it, but the state law that was passed made an attempt. It was some creative legislative drafting by the Office of General Counsel, in my opinion, in the sense that I think what really happened is that the state legislature went to the Office of Legal Counsel and said, draft me an ordinance that captures these sidewalks. And they drafted one that said, well, we really can't, but we'll make it sound like it does. Right? And so they made an attempt to define what public grounds are and define them as being sidewalks, but left room open to understand that sidewalks are characterized differently by the Supreme Court.
So it's expressive activity, sleeping and living.
Well, it could be, right? I mean, I don't know that we have governing precedent in our jurisdiction that says that, but that's the road that other courts have gone down.
I think it's been traditional that this, what everybody thinks of as a public forum is the steps of City Hall, right? I mean, that's where you hear it. And we've had our share of those, right? I mean, some of you were on the council when we did the daytime curfew a number of years ago. We'll recall that the steps of City Hall, the lobby, the bicycle storage area in the police department were all became places of protest and so on. Now, again, I don't think anybody wants to kick anybody off the steps of City Hall. What becomes a challenge is when a customer comes to do business with us and can't find their way through the crowd, or the crowd says, sign my petition and I'll let you pass. That's obviously problematic, right? We don't want to restrict fair flow in the building. So there was a couple of times where we went actually set up some stanchions and said the center part of the stairway has to be kept open and clear, and you can't accost people who come through there. And generally people have been very respectful of that. That's not always the case, and that's certainly not guaranteed to be the case. Even George, during the BRT petition gathering, I took lots of water out to Mr. Hinckley in the hot July days when he camped on our front steps and collected signatures. And we were fine with that. That was not a problem for us. The problem would be if Mr. Hinckley stepped in front of people and wouldn't let them pass until they signed his petition. That's where it's problematic. And so it's not just the boundary, but it's the behavior within the boundary.
That's what I was going to say. In some ways, it's almost the boundary almost seems ineffective in stopping that. I mean, because if you had a little corridor where you said you got to let passengers pass here, but you still allowed somebody to threaten them or to bully them in some way, the fact that they have the corridor doesn't really help.
Right, and so this gets back to Brian's point of time, place, and manner. And that's always been the standard. We have to have a reasonable time, place, and manner on both sides of reasonable, right? Both sides of the equation. So it's got to be reasonable for the protester or the person who's expressing their activity to have the right to free speech. On the flip side, we also have to protect the rights of those who choose not to engage with them.
And while Councillor Stewart had mentioned the BRT, which was one of the issues that's happened, it's not the only one. We've had several issues. In particular, one of the things that I think Gene would tell you if he's here is that he gets every year during the political season, he gets petition gatherers over there, and the vast majority of them are not homegrown grassroots efforts like BRT. They are hired. They're out-of-state petition gatherers who are being paid to get together, and they're very aggressive, and have been a big problem for the people using the facility.
Won't it increase even more? I mean, last year and the year before, with now allowing 10,000 signatures to get you on a ballot, it seems like people are going to come out every election now. It's not just going to be about medical marijuana or some of these things that we kind of perceive as, oh yeah, they'll be big, but now getting the signatures to get on the ballot we'll get people out there every time.
So,
I think now it's needed and proactive to do it. I think we should pass this legislation.
at the leadership forum yesterday, they talked about the newest ballot or signature gathering effort to get 10,000 to have us consider a new form of government for Utah County.
Yeah.
The problem with these paid petition gatherers, they're paid per signature, and so they can be very, very aggressive.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. We will move on. Was there any? Yes, this will come in. Mr. Jones, we'll be seeing this in 2 weeks in our.
Yes, I guess. Yeah, I think it's already. My understanding is already on the agenda for the meeting in 2 weeks.
We'll see it in 2 weeks. Thank you. Item 7, the discussion regarding a code amendment recommendation by the Election Code Committee to update portions of the code related to Provo City elections, presented by Councilor David Harding. All right, and Mr. Brian Jones, Council City Attorney. We have a full 5 minutes for this. Who was on leadership that budgeted just 5 minutes for this? I'm not sure where that came from. But I'm not quite sure how much we'll be able to cover in just 5 minutes. I was going to present just kind of the overall picture, and then Mr. Jones was going to dive a little bit into the details. Because these are changes that the committee and the election officials, namely our city recorder and assistant recorder, these are changes that we'd like to see implemented this fall. And so that's giving us a very tight time frame. Basically, if we're going to pass anything, it needs to be in 2 weeks. So we are not as, probably not as finalized as I wish we were at this point, but we felt like better than nothing is just to come and kind of present the direction that this is headed in. That way, if you have concerns, you can let us know now. I think Mr. Jones is going to be passing a draft around shortly. And if you can read it sooner than later, that way we can work out all the wrinkles by the time it comes back in 2 weeks, and hopefully we can move this forward. So next slide, if I could just move them along. So kind of the objectives for the committee was to update the code, align it with state code. There were a lot of places where it was redundant or conflicted, and so basically we looked carefully at the state code, we looked carefully at the local code, and said, if the state code's doing what we're trying to do in local code, let's just drop the local code. Increase the useful transparency, respect to donor privacy, reduce burden on campaigns, and just overall clarify, simplify. Next slide. So just a couple examples, like modern payment types just were not considered in the code. And previously this was called the Campaign Finance Disclosure, was the name of the chapter or title or whatever that is, but it covered far more than just the disclosure. Next. We fixed provisions that conflict with state code. We removed duplications. For example, there were 3 pages of definitions, and now we have just 2 where we wanted to modify the definition that was defined in state code. So, also, there was some ambiguity about candidates versus campaigns versus committees, particularly if these are committees to elect candidates, and it just increased a lot of the verbiage. And so we just defined what that is in one term, and it streamlines it as well. Next. Increased transparency. and Mr. Jones will get into this a little bit more, but there's no more undisclosed donors, where before each reporting period, people that donated less than $50, they didn't have to be reported. Turns out in state code that's not allowed. What is allowed still in state code is for anonymous donors up to $50. And we were kind of guessing that maybe this was back in the day of pass the hat, people would throw money in, and so cash donations of less than $50 could be anonymous. problem we saw with this is if something's truly anonymous, you don't know what the source was from, what keeps that person from donating at every stop. And so you could kind of get around kind of the intent of disclosure and transparency. In our code, we say the anonymous limit is $0. So that will increase the transparency. Also, campaigns basically could, if it was less than $250, you could just write your totals down. You didn't have to report what kind of line items, but you'd still have to keep track of that, because once you cross that 250 threshold, you would have to go back and report all of those things. So it wasn't any less of a burden on a campaign, and it could get someone in trouble because they're like, oh, well, I'm not going to hit 250, I won't keep track of this. And then if they hit 250, and how would they even know if they hit 250? Well, they'd have to know the total, but it's just not clean, it's not transparent. Also, timeliness of amended reports was something where, particularly when we look at the time sensitivity of these reports, if someone makes a mistake or omits something or whatever, and it's pointed out to them, well, they've got 30 more days to fix that. So, next slide. We were really trying to strike a balance, because transparency and privacy, there's a little tension there, transparency and kind of burden of reporting. And so what we were trying to do is maximize the value of what was required. For example, is there a lot of value to the public of having the street address of the donors? You have various things in government reporting where, like for registered voters, all of our addresses are reported, but there's a form for the government or the county where you can submit and say, for whatever reason, I don't want my address public, and for safety and things like that. So we give them an opportunity, but we don't in here. And we were publishing all of these addresses, and someone who doesn't want their address on the internet might be disenfranchised from donating. Also, but we wanted to do things while we're increasing transparency. If there's any way we could decrease the campaign burden and just maximize the value, have the information that's really valuable. For example, so no more. What's proposed is no more disclosing the addresses, but disclosing the council district of donors. So if someone's interested in where is this person's support coming from, that information would be there, but the street address isn't. Next. And then just overall, looking through it carefully, clarifying and simplifying, clarifying on the reporting. What about pre- and post-election donations and expenditures? It wasn't very clear in our code, and so that's now going to be very clear on how that's done. We're proposing that all donations must be disposed of and accounted for within 5 years of the election. Right now, it's not. You're supposed to report any activity within 90 days, but we could go back through, and probably from 20 years ago, there's a campaign that has never filed the closing of that campaign, and it's just out there. And so the state tells you what you can do with those donations to dispose of them. We're saying you can do all of that, you just have to have it done within 5 years, which allows a campaign from 2013 to then make a donation to the same candidate's campaign for 2017. So you can roll that forward, but it needs to be closed out after 5 years. That makes sense. Another thing that we're proposing is, right now, it's like, well, if you're in the primary, here are your dates of disclosure. If you're not in the primary, here are your dates for disclosure. And if you're eliminated in the primary, then you have different dates. We're recommending going to reporting periods for everyone, regardless, these are your dates, regardless of primary status. Overall, it's shorter, better organized, and we've tried to, there's plenty of areas that were really confusing, and we tried to clean it up so it's a little bit more usable by candidates. And that is, I believe, the last one, right? That's the last slide. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Jones to maybe give us a peek inside the code. But then, yeah, just any feedback if we're not going in the right direction, and then look for this probably by the end of the week, and we'll ask you to look through it so we can hopefully get this passed.
If you go back to that folder number 7, if you go up a level, what's in that? What's in that?
The selection code?
Yeah, open that table first. Just the bottom one. Yeah. Oh, is that? Yeah. Okay. So just because Councilor Harding mentioned this, I just wanted to show you this one real quick before I go to the code. So the left 3 columns is our current system, which you can see why that might be a little bit confusing, and the right-hand column is the proposed. It's the same, more or less the same number of filings, but everybody files on the same dates, is how that works. Okay, so then if you can go, Hannah, back to the folder and open that clean version. The red line is kind of a mess, but I will send it to everybody so you can see the actual changes. And we're running really short on time, so I'm just going to run through really quick kind of the structure. So Hannah, if you can just, as I talk about each subsection, just kind of scroll to that section. So first one is the definitions. As Councilor Harding mentioned, it's very short now. Really the only reason why candidate is even still in there is because subparagraph C is already part of our code. And so we left it in, which differs from state law, which basically says you're a candidate as soon as you announce that you're a candidate, because that happens a long time before the filing date in many instances. Then the filing fee, nothing's really changed there. So you can scroll on to the next one. Anonymous contributions, the one change here, those were already prohibited, but one of the things we noticed in state law is that state law allows anonymous contributions to either be given to the city or to be given to a charity. And our city code didn't provide for that, so we added that. So if you receive an anonymous donation, you have to get rid of it, but you can either give it to the city recorder or you can donate it to a charity and provide evidence to the city recorder. Going on, this section, sub 30 hasn't really changed. 40 is where the big changes are, and sub 2 is where we've consolidated that list of all the dates into one list that applies to everybody. Sub 2B there talks about if you're eliminated at a primary, you can skip some of those if you've actually closed out your account. Sub 3 is the one that Councilor Harding talked about that provides an obligation to continue to report for up to 5 years or until you've zeroed out your account. And those reports are not necessarily every 90 days, but within 90 days of any activity. So if you go 4 years without doing anything, you don't have to file every 90 days, but you have to file within 90 days of either receiving a contribution or making an expenditure until you've closed out your account. Interestingly, just so you know, because I don't know that everybody knows this, one of the things we noticed is we debated whether to put into city code a mandate that you create a separate bank account for your campaign funds. And what we realized when we started looking at it is that state law already mandates that. So, moving on. 4 is pretty much the same as it was before. So is 5. 6 is where we got rid of the address but said you have to collect them and give them to the city recorder for auditing purposes if requested. 7 is a new requirement that says once you close out, you have to keep your records for 180 days. And the actual good thing there, this was actually Councilor Stewart's suggestion, is that because it says you have to keep them for 180 days, you now know that after 180 days it's okay to get rid of them, right? Because there was no clarification about that before. 8 is the same as what was previous there. 9 is a requirement. State law doesn't require the city recorder to post it on the website until 7 days after. The committee proposed mandating that it be posted within 2 business days. Section 50 hasn't really changed, so we can skip over it. The first couple paragraphs of 60 haven't really changed, but if you go down to sub 3, if you fail to file timely, per state law, you're disqualified. Sub 4 clarifies that if you timely file but you make a mistake, the city recorder is going to give you a notice, and then in sub 5, you have 5 days to respond to that. And if you don't file an amended report, you're subject to disqualification and a Class B misdemeanor. It keeps scrolling down, and then the appeals hasn't really changed other than some technical changes. And so that's it, kind of in a nutshell.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Mr. Jones. Any feedback right now?
Two quick questions. On the section about filing, what does it say if the candidate is not available during the filing period? Is there an alternate method specified in there?
That's up right there. So you can.
Well, you're talking about during the declaration period, or are you talking about the
declaration period, yeah.
This is silent on that, but state code allows for an agent or a petition to be filed on your behalf.
Okay.
On your behalf.
Because the reason I asked that is I wasn't in town during both times.
Right, because it's only
there was an
5
alternate
day
mechanism, and I didn't see it in there. But so thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah.
And the second question, I was just wondering how Amanda, if she had any comments on this.
I am fully supportive of all these changes. I think they're going to ease the process, and I really look forward to it. It'll be positive.
Thank you, Mr. Stoll. I didn't realize Ms. Harkin, correct? Was here. Amanda, thank you for being here, and she and Janine have been wonderful in this process. Very helpful.
So our intent, unless there's specific feedback today, by the end of the day, I will send you all clean and red line versions. And as Mr. Harding, as Councilor Harding suggested, since we do need to pass this in 2 weeks in order to get it on the books before the filing period, if you're able to read it sooner rather than later and provide feedback as soon as possible, we'll try to incorporate any necessary changes before the next council meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Jones.
And I guess, well, I think the council chair has already directed it to be on for the next meeting, right? So a motion is not necessarily necessary since the council chair has put it on the agenda for next meeting.
Excellent, thank you. All right, we will move on to number 8, a discussion on the county form of government. We have 20 minutes for this. Well, I kind of think that maybe it won't take the full 20 on this. I was asked to present this, but I also think Mr. Strachan is going to help us with this a lot. Basically, as everyone knows, there are 2 efforts currently underway to change the form of the county government. One is a petition that needs to gather the 10,000 signatures in order to be on the ballot for this fall. And then the county commission also established a board to research, analyze, create a recommendation. And I believe that only really matters, I shouldn't say matters, but kind of comes into effect if the other process does not succeed. So I believe on May 23rd, that Good Governance Advisory Board that was created by the commission will be making a recommendation. And so there was a thought that if we wanted to kind of express our opinion to that Good Governance Advisory Board, now would be a time to do that. Mr. Strachan?
So, in accordance with that, so there's a couple possibilities. There are 4 forms of government that the county the Good Governance Advisory Board is looking at. I handed out what the Utah County Attorney had presented to them at the meeting last week, wasn't it?
So I sit on that board.
Yes.
I was appointed to sit on this board, the Good Governance Board.
So the mayor sits on the board, and she has asked for a chance to address the council on this issue. When we put this on the agenda, the intent, as you remember from the email we circulated, was to consider a resolution, or to consider a resolution providing guidance on what the council would like to see as a form of government for the next opportunity, or at the Good Governance Board, and to help try and influence that recommendation. You could also, I think, given the mayor, when she talks to you, would like to wait till after the GGAB has made its recommendation. But I think you could, by your discussion and by your support, at least indicate what your interest is in terms of a form of government issue. And Mayor Tafusi?
Okay. Let's go back to our website that we've got going. And can you click on the members of it, who's on it, and you can just kind of scroll through so they can see. This is our website concerning this new board that was put together. It was hand-picked. These are the people that are on it with me. It's a great governance board. We've been asked to look at the different forms of government. We've been taking a deep dive. We met every week, if not twice a week. One suggestion, well, if you look at these 4 options, those are the 4 options. And what we're asked to do is we're a recommendation board. I believe Councilor Chair Harding said, what was it you said, that if we don't agree, then this group that's trying to get this petition on will go through? What'd you say right at the beginning? I think it was opposite of what you said, though.
Okay, my understanding is that the petition thing...
There's a group of people that have gotten organized and are favoring one of these 4 options.
My understanding, if they get the 10,000 signatures and if it goes onto the ballot and if the voters pass that, then that will dictate the new form of the government, the county government. That's not true?
No, it's not true. No.
Okay.
So Wayne, do you want to speak to it?
Then you got information, because my understanding was that under the state code, that if they had it sufficient to get it on the ballot, it would be on the ballot, and then that would direct what would happen. It was also then my understanding that the Utah County Commission, I think in response and under some pressure, decided that they wanted to at least have a study, and it would come along at a later time based on the recommendation, not necessarily this year. Now, if the intent of this is to try and put it on the ballot this year, I'm not aware of that, but that would be actually a good thing.
I think what I've heard is from meeting I've been to and just trying to follow the events, is that if the 10,000 signatures are achieved and certified by the county, it goes on the ballot unless the county commission comes with an alternative choice, which would then supplant the initiative. And so that's my understanding about how this process works. And I've watched it in a couple of other counties, and that's kind of been the general philosophy, the general way it's been handled. So we are, I think 5 or 6 counties have opted for optional forms of government so far in the state. So my understanding is that if the county commission chooses not to put anything on the ballot and they get the 10,000 signatures, the initiative goes on the ballot. If they don't get the signatures, the initiative doesn't go on the ballot. But if they get the 10,000 and the county comes in with an ordinance to present to the voters, it lays over the top of that initiative petition.
Interesting.
So one thing about this, and this can maybe help solve it really quick. So they're petitioning to support one of the 4 forms, which is the council mayor form of government. There's 3 other forms. They presented at our MPO meeting with all the county mayors and myself, and I was the only mayor that's on this good governance. And my suggestion was, I don't know if we should get behind one of the 4 right now. Let's let it play out, let this process play out with this good governance board that I'm on, and see what they come out with their recommendation. Everyone on the board is feeling strongly that something, we'll recommend something's got to change. It's just a matter if we decide to go with the recommendation of the expanded county commission, or county commission do nothing, or the county council manager form versus the county executive council. So with that said, all the mayors decided not to do a resolution, and to wait and see where the Good Governance Board landed with their recommendation, and at that point, have the conversation if they want to get behind it or not. And so that's kind of where the mayor's landed.
What's the logic behind, I went to the leadership, what was it, the Leadership Council last night, and they talked about this. They mentioned that it will be partisan. What is that?
Well, that's just one of the options. There's
Partisan is required for counties under any scenario.
That's all I wanted to
There's no
understand.
nonpartisan
I mean,
option.
But it's not currently, right, for county commissioners?
Is it? Yeah, it is partisan.
Yes.
Okay, I guess I forgot that.
And how soon would there be a recommendation?
And I think we have to give it in 3 weeks.
May 23rd is when they meet to give the
Yeah,
recommendation,
it's in there.
and then they're supposed to report back to the county commission on the 28th at their Tuesday morning meeting.
So I've already shared my thoughts on that website, but I would.
Thanks, Dave, for doing that. We've been hoping people will grasp on, and how do we go back to it? There's a place where you can bring feedback and listen to the meetings and.
You bet. And so I'd like to support the mayor if she feels like it's best not for us to do a joint resolution at this time. That would be my sense. It just, anyone who wants to, can individually. Good.
I would support that recommendation, but at the same token, I would really recommend that a change be made.
So, just to make it more clear, what their petition is calling for is a mayor with 7 council members, 5 of which would have districts and 2 of which would be citywide, just like countywide.
So the petition effort, yes.
Right, so the petition is basically calling for the same government style that Provo has.
It's been really interesting. There's a lot of we've met with Salt Lake County, who has this form of government. They have 9 council members. Each one of them have a full-time employee. So we're looking at everything. We've had the city managers talk, and they've brought a new perspective in. So we're getting close to making a recommendation. There's a lot of moving parts. Do we want 9? Do we want 7? Do we want 5? Do we want Provo broken up when we become an area? There's just a lot goes into it. So our meeting is this Thursday out at Nebo School District. And on the website, if you go to the home, and meetings as well, any of it, there's all kinds of information that talks about the press releases. You can listen to the meetings. It gives the calendar exactly where we're meeting, and then we'll make our recommendation at that point. And then the county commissioners at that point can take it and do with it what they want. Because they made kind of a big deal about this committee, this Good Governance Board, I think they'll probably most likely lean towards following whatever recommendation comes out of this board.
So as far as Provo's being divided up, let's say, if it's done by population, you may not end up with a lot of choice.
And one positive that, when I was worried about that, because in the group that has the petition, they have a couple maps with options of how they've kind of configured what they would like it to look like. You can look at it in a couple ways. If Provo is split into 3 sections, that means we'll have 3 votes. That's
It's important to remember. It's important to remember that what the I can't think what they're called now, but the political issues committee, what they were looking at is they were showing you symbolically different ways it could be broken up. Just like with your redistricting process that we'll go through in a couple of years, they would have to go through a similar process based on where the population is and meeting certain parameters. And so that's all to be determined whether Provo is broken up or whether it's all intact. But somewhere along the way, you're going to assume that some cities are going to have a line through them.
Yeah.
So it could be ours.
But it takes 10 years to change it once it's set, from what I understood last night.
It's because of the census.
Yeah,
after a census. So you want to make sure you get it as...
Well, and what I envision is this one would happen before the next census if it was adopted, because we would be voting on an election for 2021, for January 1st, 2021 start. And then if you did that, you'd have the census information would come out, I think, soon after that, and you'd go through the whole process again. unless there was some kind of exemption to wait. So I think you could see 2 redistricting processes at the county level within just a few years.
The petition process provides for half the commission half of the council to be elected in the next year, not this election, but the next election.
They would have to figure out how to stagger
Right,
it.
and then they're gonna, you run for a 2-year term or a 4-year term. The mayor will be a 4-year term, and then, but that election would be the next federal election, not the next
That's
municipal
correct.
election.
That's correct. My impression when Wayne and I went as what do you call it? Interested spectators. The last meeting, and a couple observations. When I first got there, some of the discussion was going on around the table led me to believe that there is a potential bias toward an expanded county commission. But it was clear when the presenters came and spoke that, with the exception of Mayor Brunst, who actually spoke in favor of the county executive / council, which is our form, some spoke in favor of our form of government for that. The cities that are council manager preferred council manager, and I suspect that what you'll find is that whatever the inherent starting thoughts of this GGAB is, a lot of the cities and people who work in this industry are pushing for is some form of council / leader methodology to thing, as opposed to the commission. One of the problems inherent in the commission style is that they're wearing 2 hats. They're wearing both the legislative hat and the administrative hat, and it creates challenges. And in a county our size, I think there's a recognition by a lot of people that we do need some kind of separation there.
Okay, we're running late and need to get into our closing meeting, but Mr. Connect.
Yeah, checks and balances, just like Cliff was saying, it came up in the discussion the other day that, as usual, Provo has the best of everything.
I don't argue with that.
Okay, excellent. So
somehow that just doesn't go over very well.
Can I summarize? Mayor, coming into this meeting, we had circulated a draft of what a resolution could look like.
And is that resolution specific for just this one?
Yes,
The petition
but
that Brian
it was
Chapman's
near
doing?
unanimous. Everyone that responded seemed to be in favor of it if we were to pursue it. So even if they don't adopt it today, I think you probably could take away from this that this council and the council members support the form of government we have.
The 5 members have already signed on to what the petition drive is. 5 members of this council have already had their names as endorsing that. Council strong mayor form of government, 5 districts, 2 at large.
And I personally like keeping Provo together. I mean, you could say that right now, Provo, even Provo Orem, are almost half of the county. But the way that we have 3 districts, or 3 seats, but they're elected across that. Some have argued that Orem and Provo really don't have a voice at the county, on the commission. And so that would be my fear is if Provo gets pulled into 3 different districts, if none of those we have a majority on there, we might be represented by 3 different people, but be outvoted by the people outside of Provo, and so we may not have much of a voice. So
This is
anyway.
all good feedback. I'll take it all
Good.
back. This is really good.
Okay,
And
excellent.
you can email me if you have more
That's
than
not
you
an
want to say.
argument in favor of having 2 of them countywide.
If they're going to split Provo, it should be split.
Because the concern that was raised last night was, well, if you have
For the majority to be the same district.
2 countywide, doesn't that mean that the higher density populations can end up with 2 people on the council? And of course, they would say, well, yeah, it does mean that.
As it should be, yeah. Okay, but yeah, we're now running out of time for our closed meeting. So item number 9 is a discussion on a zone change request from general commercial to high density residential for 1.92 acres of land located at 442 and floor 90 South State Street. And that's 442 East, and 940 South State Street. We've got 5 minutes here.
Would you like to just save this for tonight's presentation?
Is there any objections that if we just move this presentation?
Is there anything they need to pay attention to specifically that?
No, I think this is pretty
straightforward
and pretty tight.
I have one question.
Is the east, you're right.
So it's 4 stories and yes or no on an elevator?
Oh, I don't believe there's an elevator. I think it's a walk-up. There's one 4-story building that's along State Street, and I don't believe I've designed it for an elevator.
3-story building and then some townhomes.
Right.
And this is something that we did see a year ago. So it's back, and tonight we can look at it and see how well they incorporated the council and neighborhood feedback.
What is staff's recommendation?
They made some good changes. You postponed their rezoning to send them back to work with the neighborhood group, and they've made some changes that...
And staff's okay?
Yes, and they meet their parking completely.
So we will see that tonight. Thank you very much, and thanks for helping us move that along. A closed session has been requested. Mr. Jones?
Yes, my understanding that the redevelopment agency has requested rather than the council, has requested a closed session to discuss possible sale of land. That's the only issue I'm aware of. So we could have a motion from the redevelopment agency to hold a closed meeting.
Any redevelopment agency board member want to make that motion? And we have a second, Mr. Connect and Mr. Henley. All in favor? It's unanimous.